Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode 216, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/216. And on the line, I have Connor Freeman. How's it going, Connor?
I'm great, Pat. How are you doing?
Doing good, man. Glad to have you back on the show. I was looking back. It's been over 6 months since you were here last. I think it was November.
Oh, wow. Okay. Was that the one we did with Kyle when we talked about Tim Pool?
I think it might have been, and then there was another one too. Like there was a crossover with Dave DeCamp as well. But
oh, right, yeah.
Well,
that's great.
There's been a lot of stuff that's happened since then, Connor, and also with you. Yeah. I mean, you've been writing articles at the Libertarian Institute. So have I, and I feel like we both really stepped up our game in the past 6 months, and our writing has been featured on Zero Hedge and I think some other places too, but. Not to break my arm patting ourselves on the back too much, but we wanted to talk a little bit about our writing because I don't cover my articles on the podcast. I usually, I do other subjects or something like that. But yeah, so one thing that you and I have really focused on has been China, of course, but something happened in February. I don't know if people know what that was. On February 24th, to be specific.
Yeah.
But there's been a lot of rhetoric going around, and increasingly in the last couple weeks, we've seen the foreign policy establishment in the United States beginning what they seem to fashion as a proxy war or some kind of insurgency against Russia in Ukraine, prolonging that conflict purposefully. At first it was kind of hush hush, but then they're openly kind of admitting it now. And so this is really, we have rhetoric coming out, especially in the last week, with Sergei Lavrov and Medvedev also saying that we're really risking nuclear war here. And so
they've said that they've compared it to Lavrov has to the Cuban Missile Crisis of all things. And then the worst part, I think, is you get then a report will come out where it's like, well, senior Pentagon officials say they're not concerned about it. Yeah. They don't. We monitor the threat and their capabilities all the time, and we don't anticipate a threat to NATO or to the United States. So everything's fine, everybody. Everything's fine.
And I'm working on a piece that hasn't been published yet about Lindsey Graham and his role in all of this. And I mean, do you remember this, Connor? It was like, in early March was the first time he started calling for regime change.
You know what? I do remember that quote, but I don't remember exactly what it was. Oh, yeah. You know what? I do, because he was saying...
I'm sorry. I have it in front of me, but...
He was on Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was going to let you say what it was to see if you could get it right. No, I'm kidding. But he said, is there a Brutus in Russia? Is there a more successful Colonel Stauffenberg in the Russian military?
That was it. Somebody to take him out.
And I think Keith mentioned this to me in an interview that we did. And I was like, man, I wish that Lindsey Graham would keep his fucking mouth shut, man.
Oh, well, his Fox News appearance last weekend was one of the worst things. He's one of the things that sober analysts are saying and have been basically since this all started in February was that the primary objective right now, as far as diplomacy or anything the United States could do to affect, to bring this thing to a swift end and avoid as much devastation and suffering as possible, would be to give Putin an off-ramp. Because he, in some ways, has in quite a bit, has painted himself into a corner. Because now, I mean, if he leaves without accomplishing what he said he would accomplish or giving up too much, or if, the U.S. gets what it wants, which is a total weakening of the Russian state, total destabilization and regime change, then, I mean, let's say he doesn't get regime change, but everything else up to that point, he may just get overthrown by his own military or the hardliners in his own government at that point. And, I mean, I think there's a real problem here because the American hawks seem to have no clue I mean, they imagine that, oh well, whoever takes over, it'll be another Yeltsin or somebody who's really weak, and that we can just he's just some pliable, friendly, Western friendly Russian government will take his place, and the new group of oligarchs will start running things, and everything will be great, and then we can just focus on China. And I think they really do kind of believe that. James Carden's pieces recently, he's been talking about how inside Washington, it is a absolute taboo to talk about anything the U.S. could have done to provoke this crisis, which is extremely dangerous in and of itself. But he also says that they now perceive the proxy war as going so well that they're just so smitten with themselves. They think, why stop now? Things are going so great, so they won't hear any like pessimism. They are completely allergic to any kind of talk of restraint or being prudent and avoiding these, like you were saying earlier about the chances of a nuclear war. Instead, what we see is them just coming out and bragging. You know how many Russian generals we've killed, or the Ukrainians have killed with the help of our intelligence. It was us who told them about the Moskva south of Odessa in the Black Sea and shot it and sunk that ship. We're the ones who destroyed the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, or played a huge role in it, right? And then the other thing too is when they keep boasting about how we're expanding intelligence and it's all over and we're helping them fight in the Donbass. The other weird thing too is they'll say, when like those pieces came out in the Wall Street Journal, they'll say, but we're not giving them intelligence on how to, conduct attacks in Russian territory. Meanwhile, there's this huge uptick in attacks inside Russia. Now, I'm not saying, oh, poor Russia, they should be left completely unharmed when they invade a country on their doorstep or whatever. That's not the point. The point is we're on an escalation ladder, and that is extremely provocative and can lead to all kinds of possibilities and scenarios that our ruling class refuses to even fathom or take into consideration because they're drunk on their own power. And this is their last chance at really proving that this is the unipolar moment and all of this dogma. But Lindsey Graham's a perfect example, because Lindsey Graham comes out and goes, we're not giving him an off-ramp, and we're going to take him out. And that's just it. And we're going to double down on all the military aid, and we're going to charge him with war crimes and hold him on trial at the International Criminal Court, which is a joke in and of itself because the U.S. doesn't recognize the court and has threatened to sanction it, and has been, that we're completely most of the American establishment is very opposed, particularly the Republicans like Graham or Trump, to the ICC because of what they've looked into Israeli war crimes and things like this, or even U.S. war crimes. And so, but. You see, I didn't for thee, not for me.
I didn't actually know that because, and I was working on my piece because this piece on Lindsey Graham that's coming up, I included where I expanded upon what because the U.S. Graham introduced a Senate resolution condemning Vladimir Putin and other members of the Russian state as war criminals, right? And so this Senate resolution passed unanimously, and it declares huge support for the ongoing investigations in the ICC and the ICJ. And I had no idea, I guess I just didn't know that the U.S. thinks that that's a joke. That those they refuse to be subject to its jurisdiction on if it involves themselves or Israel. But which is just so funny to hear Lindsey Graham, who, in this they would use it to take out Putin, or to, have him tried for war crimes and just to disgrace the Russian, the country of Russia and Putin himself. But they would never accept that kind of accountability for themselves. Yeah.
And they have threatened sanctions under Trump anyway.
Well, in those
for the court,
those calls for investigation and conviction, I mean, isn't that a call for regime change by other means?
Yes.
And I mean, in Biden agreed with that. It seemed like, so Biden gave his speech in Poland, which basically straight up called for Putin to go. And then he walks it back, but then he's asked again about war crimes at Bucha, right? And he doubles down and says, well, he needs to be tried and held to justice.
Yeah, it's my mistake. Actually, the U.S. has sanctioned the International Criminal Court under Trump. There's
Oh,
a whole
okay.
article about it at Human Rights Watch if people want to look that up. But yeah, no, the hypocrisy is absolutely insane. And well, Graham also said that we should basically back him into a corner, and that if he's going to use chemical weapons or, sort of akin to Kinzinger's AUMF, if he's going to use these unconventional weapons, be they nuclear, chemical, I don't know if he mentioned biological on that Fox News interview, but nevertheless, he said then he should be, he shouldn't do that, but we're going to continue to do all these policies that makes it so much more likely that he will. That's when we'll intervene directly and declare a no-fly zone and shoot down Russian planes and bomb their air defenses inside Russian territory, presumably. I mean, that's what a no-fly zone would be.
Yeah. Well, and then and Graham initially says he's not for a no-fly zone, but he says if Putin resorts to chemical weapons, then we do a no-fly zone, and if he resorts to nuclear, then we respond in kind. It seemed like, but it seems like, so just a couple points, and then I think we should move on from my piece because that's not published yet, and you didn't write it, and you're the guest. So, but I think it's interesting because we have this situation where we're caught between a rock and a hard place, right? It seems like there's this talking about how, well, Putin is going to resort to tactical nukes or nuclear attacks if he perceives that he's losing. So we can't beat him bad enough to feel like he's going to lose the war. Which I think that leaves the only pathway open is to be, some kind of thing that goes on in perpetuity,
Yeah, I think it might have been one of Cardin's pieces or somebody else's that I read where it's just, and well, it doesn't even, I mean, there was conjecture anyway. It might have been a Chas Freeman quote or something like that from one of these guys that he had interviewed, because he talked to Lawrence Wilkerson and some other, real foreign policy experts who have been in the game for a very long time. He was formerly, Chas Freeman was the ambassador, was Nixon's translator when he went to China, and he's worked for a long time with Ray McGovern and is a real, basically a foreign policy genius for all intents and purposes. And Wilkerson, of course, is the former chief of staff to Colin Powell, but. I mean, they both said, I think it's at the very bottom of that piece you're looking at. They said that it's possible that they could perceivably want to make this war last decades. And the argument was that just will mean that we're constantly on this edge of brinksmanship. Here, let's see. The U.S. and NATO allies, Ukraine and Russia, are now locked into long-term hostility. It's entirely possible that the conflict in Ukraine's east and south, like that between India and Pakistan and Kashmir, will sustain warfare for decades to come. If so, there will be a constant danger of an outbreak of hostilities on Europe's eastern frontiers and of escalation to direct conflict between Russia and the United States, including a possible nuclear exchange. Given the absence of any serious diplomatic dialogue between Washington and Moscow, this is Chas Freeman, it is far from obvious how such escalation can be prevented. And the implication from Cardin, I just listened to an interview he did with Daniel Larison and Kelly Vlahos on Crashing the War Party, is that Milley is much more in the driver's seat right now, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, than is Lloyd Austin. And Lloyd Austin said some extremely hawkish things when he came back from meeting with Zelensky along with Blinken in Kiev, and then he came back to Poland and said all this stuff about how, we want to weaken them to the point that they can't ever do this kind of stuff that they're doing in Ukraine right now. Now, if you just objectively take out all of the it's very funny that we live in America, and after everything we've done just in my lifetime and yours, the onus is on us to really overemphasize how disgusted and appalled we are that another country would illegally invade it's another country and kill civilians and bomb infrastructure and these sorts of things. But nevertheless, the point was that Pat, I've just totally lost my train of thought.
Yeah, well, so I'll jump in while you think of that. The other thing that I wanted to point out too is that all of these policy decisions, and the ones especially that Lindsey Graham is putting forward, lock us further on this path where we can't conceivably back out. And these things are political. So Lindsey Graham has proposed that we put Russia on the state sponsor of terror list, right? And that's incredibly dangerous because once they're on the list, I put in my article, there's only a few ways that we can get out of it, right? And one of them is, let's see. So if Russia is declared a state sponsor of terrorism, it will be incredibly difficult to rescind the designation. There are only two ways to remove a nation from the state sponsor of terrorism list. The first would require, quote, a fundamental change in the leadership and policies of the government of the country concerned. Both options would require the president to certify and report to Congress that the subject nation has not provided any support for acts of international terrorism in at least the preceding 6-month period, and that the government concerned has provided assurances that it will not support acts of international terrorism in the future. Putin is unlikely to ever do this in a way that would satisfy U.S. officials, is what I write. And so, likewise, I think Jason Ditz wrote a piece back earlier on, and I cited this in my Kinzinger piece because Kinzinger supported that legislation, the Stand with Ukraine Act. And essentially what that did was make it almost impossible to normalize relations between the U.S. and Russia unless Crimea was returned to Ukraine. Right. And so I think Ditz writes that essentially this led us down the path to where we are today, is where we go to this place where we're escalating things, we're putting sanctions on, diplomatically fighting war, if you will, and we can't back out of it. And that's what putting Russia on the state sponsor of terror list would do, is just lock us into this war footing.
Right. And I believe, if I remember correctly, Graham does not even pretend to have some sort of a terrorist organization he could accuse Russia of supporting. I think he compares their campaign to the Nazi invasions in Europe, and he just says that that's terroristic in and of itself, and that's what he's referring to, correct?
Yeah, he does, and he refers to Chechnya as well.
Okay.
And he refers to supporting Assad in Syria.
But again, that's not you say what you will about how he conducted himself in either conflict. It wasn't that he was backing terror. See, that's just
exactly.
Yeah. It's so.
And
again,
I point that out
CIA
too.
and Saudi Arabia were backing the Chechen Islamist types in Chechnya, and those certainly in the second war, and then obviously we know what happened in Syria with Operation Timber Sycamore and Saudi Arabia and Israel and Britain and France and all these countries, Turkey. But I'll just add the thing I was going to get to with Austin is when Austin says that we can't let them do what they've done in Ukraine. Okay, so just like I said, remove yourself morally from the equation of how you feel about what's going on in Ukraine, which we all agree is horrible. But what he's saying is they shouldn't have the ability to conventionally conduct a war or, in their perception, defend themselves in their sphere of influence or in their not even sphere of influence, right next door, to prevent themselves from being attacked by this, the largest, most deadly military alliance, which is anti-Russian intrinsically, on its doorstep. So, when they argue that we're fighting the West or we're fighting NATO through a proxy, which has been all but declared by the American. Well, it was a Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, who just said recently that we are at war. And so
I'm going to play that clip for the audience.
I wish we'd get off this and really focus on the enemy. I know there's a lot of politics here, but we're at war. We need to produce energy. As I told you, Code Point is now sending 80%, reversing Asia supply to European supply because they need it because we're at war.
Yeah.
So it's not, hyperbole for them, for the Russians to be saying this kind of stuff. And they've come out and they're rather proud of it now. Like you said, the rhetoric has changed, where before it was, oh my God, we have to defend Ukraine. And now it's just they're just being clear about it. You know, I put in my piece about when the Blinken and Austin went to Kiev, and then they came back and they're speaking in Poland. Blinken's comments, I said that he was virtually declaring that regime change was the policy, because he has something in there about how, and I'll find it, where he's basically saying, to your point about, you know, all the rhetoric they've been saying for the last couple of years that we still hear today about this, in the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. That just means that Kiev owns the Donbass and owns Crimea. And no Russian leader or faction in their whole politics is going to give up Crimea. And the likelihood of giving up the Donbass, or their support for these breakaway provinces in Luhansk and Donetsk, is just completely unlikely. And there's going to have to be some negotiation with regards to neutrality on the part of Kiev in their constitutional amendment, and they're going to have to recognize Russian control over Crimea, and maybe some sort of a deal can be worked out about the territory that they've taken along the Sea of Azov coast and the land bridge they've built from Crimea to Russia. This idea of having them under an embargo, the Ukrainians themselves, because they control the ports, and maybe they'll get access, or maybe they'll have, you know, there's going to have to be something that's worked out. But those three main points are very important. This whole resolution over Crimea, the Donbass, and the neutrality. And I think the Russians have talked about how if you want to conduct, they weren't even saying like, you know, no more military exercises, and no more. I'm not exactly, you know, it'll be interesting to see how they work out this issue of the NATO exercises, which I would argue played a huge role, especially last year, in leading up to what we see today. Just undoubtedly, the uptick in exercises that NATO is conducting, not just in the Black Sea, but within NATO itself, with the backdrop of Defender Europe 21, the largest exercises NATO has held since the Cold War, which were all conducted primarily in Eastern Europe on Russia's borders in some cases. This was a massive provocation. I mean, it went on virtually all year last year. For most of the year, they were training for war with Russia. You know, you could see them out there. You could see it out the window, basically, right? So, but Blinken came out and said in Poland, the strategy we've put in place, massive support for Ukraine, massive pressure against Russia, solidarity with more than 30 countries engaged in these conflicts, is having real results. The bottom line is this: we don't know how the rest of this war will unfold, but we do know that a sovereign, independent Ukraine will be around a lot longer than Vladimir Putin is on the scene. And Austin said, we want to see Russia weaken to the degree they cannot do the kind of things they have done in invading Ukraine. It has already lost a lot of military capability and a lot of its troops. And quite frankly, we want to see them not have the capability to very quickly reproduce that capability. Austin loves the word capability, I've found. Yeah.
Quickly, you said something about the three main most important objectives for Russia, right? And one of them is, you said no Russian leader is going to give up that claim to Crimea. And you want to explain why that's the case, just for the viewers?
Yeah, sure. It's Crimea was won in the days of Catherine the Great from the Turks in 1783, years before the American Constitution was ever written. And they lost hundreds of thousands of troops defending it from the Nazis and the Romanians in World War II. It's the home to the single year-round warm water port that they have. Zbigniew Brzezinski has commented before that if you take Crimea, if you take Sevastopol from the Russians, they go from not even being like a superpower to no longer even being a regional power. It is their through the Bosphorus Strait. It's their way to get to the Mediterranean. They're not giving it up. There was even, you know, and the truth is that, you know, there's a great article that John Quigley wrote recently on responsible statecraft about how the whole history of how basically after the Cold War, Crimea won. They held elections and they elected a leader who wanted to join the Russian Federation, and the Russians said no. and the Ukrainians said no as well. So the deal that was made, of course, was the lease agreement, which is that they keep that base and protect it with, I believe they were allowed to have up to 25,000 troops there at a time. And at the time of the coup in Ukraine in 2014, when they essentially non-violently in a coup de main took the peninsula, they had like 16,000 troops there. And it is so strategically critical to them and has such a deep connection to that country, culturally, historically, economically. It is just absolutely a red line, because it's literally a part of Russia. Even when the leader of the Kherson region now is saying that he would like to join the Russian Federation, he goes, and I don't even want to do a referendum. Because he goes, look, they held a referendum in Crimea, and this is true. In fact, you know what? I really recommend people, because you're going to hear from hawks all the time that was he invaded Crimea and all this stuff, and they'll argue about the polling data and this sort of thing. That's been, they held a referendum after the coup de main, so that's fair, but super majorities. I'm talking like 80, 90+% said that they, including the Ukrainian population there, which I believe is something like 25% maybe of what's of the people on the peninsula, they wanted to join the Russian Federation. They did not any longer want to be a part of Ukraine, and this has been done. They've conducted Gallup polls to look at this, and there's a really great piece that I just would recommend people read by Robert Perry called "The Crimeans Keep Saying No to Ukraine." I think that's what it's called. But anyway, this is just the whole point, is that if they try to take Crimea, which this is Zelensky's, he calls it the Crimean platform. So Zelensky was elected in 2019 with a massive mandate, I believe 73%, to make peace with the Russians and to implement Minsk II, which would have implemented a ceasefire in the Donbass, ended the war for all intents and purposes, and granted autonomy to these breakaway provinces and republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. He wanted to do that, but because of pressure from the ultra-nationalists and the Nazis, and the absolute refusal on the part of the Americans or the EU to pressure Zelensky and to give him the support that he needed in order to be steadfast and to actually make that deal, he ultimately buckled, and then just basically has carried out a policy that's been more or less dictated by the ultra-fascists and essentially the American empire and the NATO hawks. And so the Crimean platform is his policy, which the first meeting of which was attended by every member of NATO. And then all throughout 2021, I remember reading Rick Razaroff covering meetings he was having with, Poland and some of the Baltic states leaders and foreign ministers. And all they kept saying was, yep, even the Turks, actually, who have proved to be more of a mediator and a moderating influence on all this, at least for the time being, than a lot of these other NATO states and governments. But, they would all say, we're taking it back. We're going in. We're going to retake Crimea. We're going to retake the Donbass. And in the meantime, while they're saying all of this, it appears to have the support of NATO for all intents and purposes. And then NATO is training them for war with Russia the entire time, including in Ukrainian territory. So I'll just say that's why they won't give up Crimea, and that plays a huge role in why they took the peninsula in the first place when it was threatened after the coup, and it's a huge reason why they went into this. They actually invaded, because the Ukrainians had mobilized forces, particularly in the east, but also they were folks getting together in the south and stationing troops more in the southern part of Ukraine, where Crimea is, and so they went in. It's debatable about what their ultimate gains were. But I think if you listen to what Putin said at the onset of the conflict, including on the Monday of the week the whole war started, he said, I'm going in to repel Ukrainian aggression against these republics. And the truth is that there was a massive uptick in ceasefire violations and explosions recorded by the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And they had amassed something like 100,000 troops near the contact line with the Donbass. The Ukrainians had. And so that doesn't justify what Putin did, but it does suggest that Putin is willing to keep the war going himself in order to maintain control of Crimea and to protect those regions. Maybe protect isn't the greatest word, but I mean, that's their argument. Those republics and ethnic Russian populations in the Donbass.
So another thing that you mentioned, and I think that was a perfect segue into some of the work that you've been doing in the articles that you wrote leading up to this whole situation, right? Cold War Served Hot being one of them. But in that, you discuss these NATO military exercises. And before we get into kind of some of those exercises, like Defender Europe, because I wrote a piece on that too. But
it's one of my favorites.
Well, I appreciate that. U.S. launches 2 sets of military exercises in Europe. This is by Kyle and Will from May 3rd. So I know we were talking about that a little bit before we hit record button. But Kyle and Will note Swift Response 2022. This is an annual drill. And then the start of Defender Europe 2022 started on Sunday, and I think that was May 1st through the 27th. So this year's exercise is a little less involved than I think last year, was it? But you and
it's significantly smaller, but it's still a massive and provocative drill.
Yeah.
I believe it was 31,000 troops from 27 countries last time in 2021. I can verify that really quick. I've got some notes on the various exercises.
Kyle says more than 30,000 from 27 nations in 2021.
Yeah. And now it's, what is it, like 18? Oh, yeah, I see. Okay, so, right, 18,000 from 9 countries.
Yeah.
Oh, more than 20 countries. Excuse me. It's conducted in 9 different countries.
Oh, yeah, from
20
different 20 different nations. Yeah. So I'm just going to throw up your article, Cold War Served Hot. I was kind of flashing it on the screen earlier. So did you and I write our articles kind of at the same time, kind of going over because I wrote the danger of renewed great power competition.
Right. Well, basically, I think for the most part, we worked on that. I don't know. I had written some stuff early in the year, particularly about the escalations in the new Cold War with Russia and China that Biden seemed to be embarking on full throttle as soon as he came into office. And what I said was when we were talking about your piece while you were working on it I was like, you got to look into Rick Rozarov, because he at the time was a contributing editor to antiwar.com, I believe. And he runs a site called Antebellum, which he's essentially a NATO watcher, and nothing gets by Rozarov. And so virtually every exercise and detail of each exercise have been recorded in his archive there. So I thought it's a gold mine for people who want to look up and understand exactly what the heck was going on in 2021 that led to what we see today, which is people can, mock the Russians and go, you're just supposed to sit there and take it, you second tier, third rate, glorified gas station of a country. But they didn't. And the fact is that at any point, Biden could have stopped all of this. But instead, in November, as I'm sure in Cold War Served Hot, I'm pretty sure it's at the end, but certainly in my other piece, Shoving Match from December, in November, they simulated a nuclear first strike with strategic bombers less than 12 and a half miles off of Russia's coast or borders. And that, in the meantime, I think they escalated the number of bomber deployments by 2.5 times. I think even Sergei Shoigu came out and was, really saying, do you have any idea what this is? What kind of danger this is? What kind of danger we're in right now? Why are you flying strategic bombers right off our borders, practicing first strikes? And then also, I always point out that on Thanksgiving you're getting together with your family and having a few beers and enjoying your day. Well, the U.S. Navy, the 6th Fleet, is sending a guided missile destroyer into the Black Sea to provoke Russia. And at the beginning of November, they sent another 2 warships into the Black Sea. So this kind of stuff was ongoing. In fact, Stars and Stripes reported at the beginning of this year, I think, that last year, in addition to all the exercises that you cover in your piece, they escalated the naval presence in the Black Sea, and I believe the Baltic Sea as well, but certainly in the Black Sea, by 125%. That I think that is, I've said for a minute that I think they basically jumped the shark. It has a lot to do, I think, for sure, with the escalated arming of Ukraine and the NATO exercises that were going on in Ukraine and how it looked like there was going to be a major escalation in the Donbass, which there arguably was the week before Putin invaded. But the just the fact that, at the end of 2020, they're going in Stars and Stripes a year before this report I just mentioned came out, and they're going, it's a real shame that with the whole COVID pandemic, we were only able to be in the Black Sea for like 82 days in 2020. So in 2021, now that Mr. Normalcy is back, we're going to really escalate it. So as soon as Biden came into office, if you read antiwar.com, you saw, I think within the less than a week of him coming into office, this is all stuff I wrote about at the time because Dave was on top of every last bit of it. But basically, they sent a series of warships into the 3 warships including, I believe, 2 guided missile destroyers into the Black Sea, and they started training with the Ukrainian Navy after a Russian fighter made I forget what you call that, but it basically flew right over one of the American ships, like a low fly kind of a scenario, and the answer to that was, we're conducting drills now with the Ukrainian Navy. And he also sent warships and an aircraft carrier strike group and a bunch of warplanes to the South China Sea, and sent a B-52 over the Persian Gulf, eyeing Iran before the end of January. And it's been like this. Biden's administration has been so hawkish, and we've been covering this at the Institute the whole time, but they have all of 2021 was a massive ramp up in the, military presence around China and Russia. And basically he's escalated on all fronts with the exception of Afghanistan, but he's starving all those people to death right now with his economic war and freezing the central bank assets and the rest of this policy right now. And even Yemen, if you look at it, the guy basically begrudgingly let that war at least ostensibly right now anyway, it looks like it's really is starting to wrap up. The airport's going to be open very soon. The Saudis just let in a couple of aid ships without even putting them through the usual delays that are entailed in the blockade, and that's for all intents and purposes been lifted. So there's some good news there, but I'm just saying that Biden's policy all through last year was just this hit the accelerator on every front, and they clearly have not only, we've discussed before we started recording how they're going to balance now this new proxy war in Eastern Europe and Ukraine with the whole effort to encircle China. But with China, they flew 2,000 plus warplanes in the East China Sea, the LSC, and the South China Sea before the end of the year. That was being reported in November, and I think they flew nearly 100 sorties in the South China Sea that month, and certainly in the 90s anyway. And it's just been crazy. It's I don't know how conscious Biden even really is, but whoever's running his administration, we've seen is the most important constituency, at least in terms if you had to judge it by the policy, would be the military-industrial complex.
Well, let's touch on that a bit because I wanted to get into it a bit more because I wrote this piece, Uncle Sam's Grand Delusion, talking about the 2022 NDS strategy, the National Defense Strategy, talking about how China's been upgraded to the number 1 position, the number 1 enemy of the American empire. In 2018, Mattis came out with the 2018 NDS, which named Russia and China as being co-equal great power competitors. And so now it's still China, and the NDS was amended, and they were scrambling to amend it after the Ukraine situation took off, because of course they wanted to justify all the new spending in that area. But essentially what my thesis is, and I didn't feel like I supported it as much as I could have. But my thesis is that they're crazy if they think that they're going to put, a stopper in the Ukraine situation and still confront China and still plan on encircling China 100%. And I guess the point that I made before we started recording is just that, and I think you agree, is that there's so many weapons going into Ukraine and they're disappearing into a black hole. And it just seems like, well, so many weapons are going in and so much money is being printed that we just don't have enough gas left. I mean, how could we possibly do like full spectrum dominance in China at the same time?
Right. And you said that they changed the NDS after that because of the Russia issue. So they went from acute. It was acute what they settled on, the acute threat of Russia.
Yeah,
but
it
the
is.
pacing challenge is the main threat is China. I have the quotes somewhere here, but
I don't think that the fundamental substance of the 2022 NDS did not change. It still, was focusing on China as being the main pacing challenge and Russia being an acute threat. But the general outlook for the next, I don't know how many ever years, is still China at the forefront. And
right.
like they're going to somehow deal with Putin and Russia in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, so here's the best I can sort of figure it right now. It looks like they are absolutely dead set, and there's virtually no opposition except token opposition. I'll give them credit. We've discussed a lot of their flaws, but it does appear that these handful of Republicans, actually 57, voted against this $40 billion aid package, which the Democrats took a $33 billion aid proposal from Biden and escalated it by like, oh yeah, well, we raise you $3.4 billion in weapons and $3.4 billion additional so-called humanitarian assistance. And because like when you're sacrificing a whole country, you always want to send them like some food maybe or something just to keep them fed while they're all dying for NATO.
Sure.
Right.
Throw that in.
But they basically, it looks like they're going to, because you have senators now talking about the Defense Production Act and how they want to, for all the crying and fear mongering about semiconductors, which reminds me of this idea of, well, we got to stay in the Middle East and we got to go to war with all these countries because what about all the oil? And then Roger Stern, the economic geographer, I believe from Princeton, was the one who did that study in 2010 that showed from, I think, the late 70s to 2007 maybe, we misspent $8 trillion on protecting sea lanes in and out of the Persian Gulf when they weren't under threat. And but the semiconductor argument is used as this rationale for like, if we have a semiconductor shortage, that could be really problematic. So we should prepare to go to war with China because that would be less bad. Nuclear war, right? So, and people just sort of buy that because of how many semiconductors are produced in Taiwan. And I mean, it's superficially a plausible an argument for most people. But the funny thing is, these same hawks who, and I have to really quickly just say, the right wingers who continue to pretend like, oh, I'm edgy because I'm talking about how we should go to war with China. I'm not I almost said a bad word. I'm not one of these pansy Democrats who was only focused on Putin. I'm talking about China. And it's so funny because basically your foreign policy is Anthony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, Hillary Clinton, Kurt Campbell, and Joe Biden's and Barack Obama's foreign policy. So give me a break. I mean, you're a Democrat for all intents and purposes, right? And I mean, this is the Democrats' deal, the Asia pivot, really. Trump expanded it, but Biden has made what he did, at least in the first year. He's doubled all the aircraft carrier strike group deployments, practically doubled them, and then certainly well over. He's more than doubled the number of warplanes and spy planes over there and continued all the warship transits through the Taiwan Strait every month. But it does seem to me that they intend to carry on with this Asia pivot, with AUKUS and all of these, the nuclear submarine technology sharing agreement that we now have with the Australians and the British. which totally undermines the whole non-proliferation regime in that area. And then, of course, I believe we're still going to be building up the Quad. Hopefully, India starts to drift away and has better relations with China going forward, because they do seem to be bucking the U.S. on their whole anti-Russia sanctions policy and cutting off, energy imports and things like this. So that would be nice to see.
Let me add something quick. Sorry. So if India starts getting more buddy with China, what are we going to call the Indo-Pacific then?
Oh God, this is the problem with being a world empire, and you don't want to say South China Sea, because then everybody goes, isn't that kind of China? Isn't that more China's problem than ours? So he said Indo-Pacific. Maybe we'll just call it. I honestly think they should just tell the American people this is the Asia pivot.
Yeah.
Come on. So, because that's what Obama called it, right? So, Hillary Clinton said the South China Sea is a vital national security interest of the United States. If they could get somebody like, Tucker Carlson seems to be pretty convincing to a lot of people when he says, nuclear war with Russia over Ukraine, give me a break. Trading lanes in the South China Sea, that maybe. Trade routes in the South China Sea. But anyway, I think they just seem to, the policy, my analysis of Trump and Biden was essentially that they escalate on most fronts. And that even if Trump didn't start a war, he vastly escalated the new Cold War with Russia and China. He vastly did things. He escalated our deference to Israel on Middle East policy in ways that neocons had only written about previously. He, with the ripping up the Iran deal, was something that the FDD and all these worst hawks, neoconservatives in particular, had wanted forever. And obviously, he escalated all these bombing campaigns in Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen. And then Biden, like we've already said, he escalated a bunch of these Trump policies. So my gut feeling is that they don't care about economics, and they'll implement these crazy schemes, like with the Defense Production Act, where they go, yeah, well, we really need all those semiconductors for Javelin missiles and Stingers, and Democrats are and I don't know. Hopefully, the Republicans will stand in the way of that, because I don't know if that's been voted on yet. This defense, I don't think it has. This defense production, it's just a bunch of senators saying that that's what we should do.
No, I think it was signed. I think Biden signed it like last week.
Well, that might be Lend-Lease, but this is.
Oh,
that'll essentially be the same thing, just under a different name, because it does allow them to get first preference with different manufacturing parts that, in a free market, would go to whoever's willing to pay the most for them.
I got them. You're right. I got them mixed up. It was Lend-Lease. Yeah.
But so they're willing to, subordinate semiconductor production and use for any myriad of things that we're told that we should go to war with China if we can't do. But for the sake of Raytheon Stingers and Lockheed and Raytheon's Javelins, so there's real lunacy to all this, but it does seem like we're spending more in the military than we have ever in our history. I do sort of sense as much as there's all this, like we said, the unipolar moment, euphoria that still pervades Washington in the wake of the Cold War. This belief that we can continue to do whatever we want. Cardin says that their policy is to basically regime change Putin and then take on China. So if that's the case, then they may be working on a faster timeline than we perceived. I used to wonder and be a little concerned that if, in my articles, that maybe I'm being a little too in my conclusions and the way when I editorialize it, I'll say, look, we're headed towards serious brinksmanship and potentially nuclear war with Russia and China, that a hot war could start here very soon if we don't, the American people don't do something about this, because the think tankers, the military industrial complex, the military establishment, and these, the people that our ruling class essentially have picked these countries, Russia and China, as their golden ticket to get whatever they want from now on in terms of military expenditures and these hegemonic policies. But I didn't expect there to be a war the next year. I didn't expect Putin to go in there in the next year. So, but that is what happened. And, we were just talking before the show started about how the State Department removed from its website any reference to the one China policy. And Ned Price, after the foreign ministry spokesman for China came out and said, this is a major provocation, Ned Price goes, give me a break. We do stuff like this all the time, basically. And of course it is. If they remove this stuff about not supporting Taiwanese independence and not recognizing that China is the sole legal government, the Beijing is the sole legal government of China, and that it's not, it's one. It's, like you said, the one China policy. If you remove any reference to that on the State Department website, that's just a clever way of changing the policy. How many times did Biden say we're obligated to defend Taiwan if it's attacked by China last year? I believe he said that at least twice, but those were all called gaffes. But when he said, I want to, for God's sakes, this man can't remain in power, we were told that was a gaffe. And now Blinken is saying the same things, basically. And they're just admitting it flat out in the mainstream press that we want this war to continue. The Ukrainians should continue to fight and die because we don't want it to end too soon at too high of a cost for Europe, which really just means we don't want it to end at too low of a cost to Russia.
What I found really interesting is that 2 days after so it wasn't the first time Lindsey Graham called for regime change in Moscow, but on one of his most vitriolic times doing it, on March 24th, Graham goes on Fox News on March 24th, 2020, and says, "What I would like the President of the United States to say is that I want him to say, I believe Ukraine can win. I'm committed to them winning. I will hold Putin accountable. He needs to go. He's a war criminal on an industrial scale." 2 days later, Connor, President Biden is filmed getting out of that helicopter, and he says Putin is a butcher, and he says, April 5th, so this was a couple weeks later. After Graham says he wants Biden to say those things I just read. Then Biden is filmed getting out of the helicopter and says, there can be no forgive and forget when it comes to Putin. We must hold him accountable for the rule of law to mean anything. Okay, sorry, I misread my own article. On March 24th, Graham gets on Fox News and says, this is what I want Joe Biden to say. 2 days later, Biden is giving the speech in Poland and says, for God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. And then his press corps calls that a gaffe. And then on April 5th, so this is a few days after the Poland speech, Biden doubles down and basically repeats exactly what Graham told him to say on Fox News, is what I'm getting at. So
was this after how did this line up with Bucha? Was this when he said to the reporters, he is committing genocide?
Exactly.
Look at Bucha.
Yeah, so 2 days after Graham goes on Fox News and says what he wants Biden to say, Biden gives the Poland speech. Then Bucha happens a few days after that. And then on April 5th, Biden's filmed getting out of the helicopter saying Putin has to be held accountable. So, I mean, I don't know.
Well, to your point, the thing about the right-wing hawks is the way it works, it seems to me right now, is so Trump was worse on Russia arguably than even Obama was, certainly when it came to Ukraine and the arms treaties. And even sanctions and expelling diplomats and things like this. Now, he was painted by most of the mainstream media apparatus that he was he's a Kremlin puppet, right? And a softy at best on Russia. And that's completely, the other way around. Now, on the other hand, with Biden's case, the Republicans call him Beijing Biden, but he's been way worse on China than even Trump was. He's taken everything Trump did, including the trade war. They're just now talking about maybe lowering tariffs because of how bad prices are here in America. But for all intents and purposes, he's taken the Trump policy and escalated it with China. And now, but he's still viewed by a large segment of the population as this secret Beijing sock puppet. And so it's very bizarre, but they, like with the Iran deal, when the Senate passes a motion like they did this past week that says we will not support a deal if you take the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, off the foreign terrorist organization blacklist, if you don't address their sanctioned oil trade with China that we want to really crack down on and really, forcefully enforce those sanctions. And also they said, you have to address their ballistic missiles their regional malign activities. And so when he gets that message that passed 62 to 33 or whatever it was with heavy Democratic support, considering none of them should have voted for that. The only Republican no vote was Rand Paul. There were 3 abstentions in the GOP. But Chuck Schumer voted for this thing. Chris Coons, of all people, the guy who was just recently saying we should send U.S. troops to Ukraine, his argument is because of the brutality. I love that argument, that we should all kill ourselves in nuclear war because of the brutality.
It boggles my mind that this shit works on people, man.
That was his whole argument. I remember being floored by it. I was like, okay, if you're going to advocate this, then you got to have something. There's got to be some good line here.
Josh Hawley's press corps saying that, Josh flew airplanes in Iraq and Afghanistan, so therefore...
Oh, this is Kinzinger, though, right?
Oh, you're right. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. No, thanks for correcting me. Kinzinger, his press corps says, Adam Kinzinger, House Rep Kinzinger flew airplanes in Iraq and Afghanistan.
He knows.
So therefore, he knows when a no-fly zone is warranted.
Oh, Jesus. Oh,
that's what it said, dude. Fuck.
They should have said, Hillary could have probably, when she was advocating, although all the Republicans except Trump and Rand, I think, were back in the no-fly zone in Syria. It's crazy how we went from, I opened something I wrote a little while, one of my pieces that, I think it is Cold War Served Hot, where we go from everybody going, dodged a bullet that Hillary didn't get elected. She wanted a no-fly zone in Syria, and that was 2016. Yeah. And then less than 2 years later, in February of 2018, right in the beginning of February, Trump is bombing Russians in Syria, mercenaries no less, but still.
Did you say that Rand supported a no-fly zone in Syria?
Oh no, I'm saying he didn't.
Oh, he didn't. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I think virtually every other Republican in the field except for Trump and Rand did.
I misunderstood you. Hey everybody, Patrick McFarland here. I'm really excited to tell you guys about the newest sponsor of the Liberty Weekly podcast, and that is Crowd Health. When I launched my law practice a few months ago, I found myself without health insurance. I searched through the individual healthcare plans on healthcare.gov and was appalled at the high cost and poor coverage. So I decided to try out Crowd Health. That's right, I use Crowd Health myself. Now, there's a reason why healthcare costs are so high. That is because healthcare is no longer something that takes place between you and your doctor. Everyone listening to this podcast should already know that big insurance and big pharma unite with big government to squeeze every penny that they can from you. This, of course, drives costs up. For instance, Obamacare caps the percentage of profit that health insurance companies can make off of premiums. How then do they make more money? Well, they charge a higher premium. So there's no incentive for insurance companies to negotiate for lower prices on your behalf. Enter Crowd Health. You pay one low monthly total, usually less than $200, to fund a healthcare account that is yours. Then you choose whatever doctor that you want. And if you have a big bill, Crowd Health will crowdfund that bill for you so you can pay the doctor or hospital quickly. Now, to help you along the way, Crowd Health will assign you and your family a personal care representative. My care representative is named Maggie, and if I have any questions, Maggie is just a text or a phone call away. When I enrolled, Maggie called me to get to know me. We spent a great deal of time discussing my needs and goals with my own healthcare. Maggie's great. Stop supporting the broken health insurance system with your hard-earned dollars. Go to joincrowdhealth.com now and experience freedom from health insurance like I do. Right now, you can get your first 3 months for just $99 per month. That's almost 50% off the normal price, and it's a heck of a lot less than a high-deductible healthcare plan. So just go to joincrowdhealth.com and use promo code LW99 at sign-up to tell them that I sent you. That's joincrowdhealth.com, promo code the letter L, the letter W, and the number 99. Now, disclaimer, Crowd Health is not health insurance, and that's a good thing. It's a totally different way of paying for health care. Terms and conditions may apply. My other question, I mean, like, so right now Rand is single-handedly holding up this $40 billion aid package to Ukraine, right? Because he's saying that he wants some kind of inspector
general, I believe, to monitor the money, which to me seems like, I don't know. I was hoping for something better than that. Like we should really be, that's great, but it's just, it's not exactly, Ron Paul, I can't see being like, we need an inspector general to look at this. You know, we need a blue ribbon committee.
Okay. Yeah. Well, my other thing though, dude, is like, so again, in this article about Lindsey Graham, I'm writing about these Senate resolutions, and they're passing unanimously, which means that Rand Paul either abstained from the vote or voted for this.
He did vote for Lend-Lease.
He did. You're right.
Michael, I put that in one of my articles because Michael Tracy goes every single one of them, from Bernie Sanders to Rand Paul.
Well, and I mean, I guess I could click on the link and see what the vote was for these Senate resolutions to see if
they usually pass unanimous. The Senate is even much more hawkish than the House. The Republicans have really been opposing the stuff in the House. And then I think there was even that bill about confiscating the property that is taken from the so-called Russian oligarchs and then giving it to Ukraine. I think even AOC and some of the Squad girls opposed that because they said it's a violation of the Fourth Amendment, and you know, this is going to be used against American citizens and minorities, and look at how much property is already taken through these civil asset forfeiture laws, which was nice. But then, you know, you read Cardin's piece about the Progressive War Party and its evolution right now, and it sounds like Pelosi has she rules that from her perch there as the the majority leader in the House. I mean, she's able to she cracks the whip and rules that thing with an iron fist, and they have largely supported most of this anti-Russian legislation, is my understanding. The Squad, I mean.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to find what the vote total was for each side. But yeah, I mean, what do you make of that, dude? Of Rand of voting for the Lend-Lease?
Oh, I think it's despicable.
Yeah,
we shouldn't. Listen, Rand Paul's the guy who signed a letter with that Tom Cotton wrote to send to Tehran to say, hey, guess what? I know that Obama just signed this deal with you, but as soon as we get a Republican in office, we're going to rip that thing up. Yeah. So you just don't get too comfortable, buddy. And I thought that was despicable. The guy's been pretty weak on a lot of things. But Lend-Lease, that's just despicable. You can't really defend that. And listen, it's not – this is an undeclared – we're at war. This is a proxy war. We keep being told that by these officials. Has there been a declaration? No. That's where Ron Paul would start, right? He would start with Article 1, Section 8, and say this is unconstitutional, and he would talk about NATO expansion, and he would talk about the whole new Cold War policy, and how, if anything, Ron would be, as he does on his show every week, talk about how Kennedy maintained leader-to-leader communication lines with Khrushchev, and that's how we avoided nuclear catastrophe in the Cuban Missile Crisis, because he was able to make a deal that, even behind closed doors, they didn't announce this to the public, but okay, I'll take my missiles, the Jupiter missiles, out of Turkey if you take your missiles out of Cuba. And so they did that. But the Americans, I mean, look, Blinken hasn't spoken to Lavrov since February 15th.
Yeah.
There's no way Biden is going to talk to Putin. And they had a chance to avoid all this. They had 4 months of talks. Well, not really, but the Russians put forward their security proposals in December, and then they could have resolved all this by just saying, you know what, we won't bring Ukraine into NATO. But as we've heard from the State Department, hey, this is bigger than just Ukraine. This is about principles. and it isn't. It's not about anything to do with principles, but they claim, any state has a right to join, whatever alliance or group of, partnership with what country and have an independent foreign policy and join any sort of military pact they want. That's why, Cuba is a part of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And that's why China always hosts their their military drills in Mexico and stuff like that, because we believe in those principles. But that is just simply not the case. But they, I don't know, man. It's just, Ron has been so good on this. He and Dan on the Liberty Report. Yeah. It's nice that Rand is holding it up for maybe a week, and then he gets an inspector general in there. The problem is that there shouldn't be any military aid going to Ukraine. So, I mean, if you get a guy in there to look over the numbers, it's $40 billion of aid. I believe between that and the bill last month, was it last month or was it March? Whenever they signed that big omnibus bill that had the $13.6 billion in it for weapons aid to Ukraine, in addition to funding, replenishing the weapon stocks in the Pentagon that are running dry supposedly, and then all the sending more weapons and deployments to troop deployments to Eastern Europe. All of this stuff is all sort of bungled together, but for all intents and purposes, this Ukraine aid just this year is set to surpass the entire State Department budget.
Yeah. It's insane.
Yeah. So, I mean, just saying that we're going to have somebody, take a highlighter and maybe a red pen and go, I can't believe they're sending. That's too many. Maybe that's too many stingers. I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. I haven't heard enough of his proposal to be too excited about it. But like I said, the standard is very low.
Yeah.
And so, but it is interesting how quickly we're able to just go, that guy's a hero.
Right. Yeah.
That's kind of.
I mean,
we're a little jumping the gun here. His father's a hero.
I have heard some people dicker about it. You know what I mean? Like you said, Michael Tracy pointed out that he voted for the Lend-Lease program. I'm having like this crisis right now because I'm looking at Lindsey Graham's press announcement, right? It says the war crimes resolution unanimously passes. And you can go to the text of the resolution here. This was on March 15th. But if you go to the page, it doesn't say anything about the resolution passing. It just says it was agreed to in Senate. Right?
Oh, this is Graham's the war crimes resolution. Is that what he said?
Yeah, and I'm trying to figure out if Rand Paul voted for it or not, but I just can't find any voting record saying it passed.
It might have been a voice vote or something.
You know what? I think it was. So is there no record of a voice vote?
Sometimes. I'm pretty sure that's the case. I've found that pretty frustrating in the past too, because you can't narrow down who voted for what.
Yeah.
There's also weird things where you're like, someone will say this senator voted for this thing, and then you click the link to exactly the kind of page you're looking at.
Yeah.
And then you look through it and it's just not documented. It just says, whatever, a majority said yay. So.
Well, and if it passed unanimously, then either Rand voted for it or he abstained.
Exactly.
So, okay, well, we're about an hour and 5 minutes in. I just wanted to, I guess, before we get going here today, what do you close with just kind of a discussion about what do you think are the real possibilities for some kind of nuclear engagement?
Everybody that we read and that I hold in high esteem right now is saying that we're closer to nuclear war than any time. Well, actually, they're arguing that it's even worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, that's what Ron would say, because, like I said earlier, there just is no communication. And I think that the policy... The point about Austin, like, I really was taken aback when I saw that quote, because whatever you think of Russia... They're one of the three stools, at least, of the multipolar world, and it's there's a lot more development. India plays a huge role in the world and all these things. And it's not just, the U.S. unipolar world order anymore. And the idea that they think that Russia should, as Pat Buchanan wrote a piece about this that I thought was just great. He says, so you want to cripple them to the point where that, and as Austin said, when he's bragging about losing military capacity and troop casualties, that is so provocative and just, we would never put up with something like that. If the Russians were funding a proxy war with America in a neighboring country and then bragging about how many American troops were dying.
Yeah.
And
well,
then
just think about the remember the Afghanistan bounties story
exactly
and the outrage over that. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, sure. You're absolutely right. People were calling for blood. And so the idea that he can just talk about that. And basically so Buchanan's argument is, so you're really trying to take away every last card they have except the nuclear one, except the nuclear option. You want to basically relegate them to being back so far into a corner that all they have left is their 6,000 nukes, roughly 6,000. And that's the policy. But as we said, the craziest thing about all this is it really does appear that they wanted to do this. So you wrote a great piece on General Stavridis recently, but I have this great quote of him from James Stavridis from the New York Times. This was in, I want to say, January. The famous piece from the New York Times is called U.S. Considers backing an insurgency in Ukraine if Russia, or something like that, right? And he says, if Putin invades Ukraine with a major military force, U.S. and NATO military assistance, intelligence, cyber, anti-armor, and anti-air weapons, offensive naval missiles would ratchet up significantly, said James Stavridis, a retired 4-star Navy admiral who was the supreme allied commander of NATO. And if it turned into Ukrainian insurgency, Putin should realize that after fighting insurgencies ourselves for 2 decades, we know how to arm, train, and energize them. He pointed to American support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet invasion there in the late 70s and 1980s, and before the rise of the Taliban. The level of military support for Ukrainian insurgents, Admiral Stavridis said, would make our efforts in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union look puny by comparison. Both Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they warned their Russian counterparts in recent telephone calls that any swift Russian victory in Ukraine would probably be followed by a bloody insurgency similar to the one that drove the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. In discussions with allies, senior Biden officials have made clear that the CIA covertly and the Pentagon overtly would both seek to help any Ukrainian insurgency. The other big risk is, and they essentially carried all that out. They're expanding intelligence every few weeks. It's announced in the mainstream papers that that's what they're doing, or it's announced by the Pentagon. The escalation in military aid it's getting to the point where it's hard to keep track of. But they're sending in attack helicopters. They're sending in drones. They're sending in more Stingers and more Javelins and, our heavy artillery and vehicles to carry the new the howitzers and, hundreds of thousands of rounds of artillery rounds and millions of rounds of ammunition and small arms and all this stuff. So now, Brzezinski said that he wanted to. Kyle put this in his piece about Hillary Clinton, the interview she did with Rachel Maddow when this all started, where she's all practically wetting herself, talking about how she can't wait for this to get going because we're going to bleed them just like we did in the 80s. And she compares it to Afghanistan and all this and goes, yeah, but there were some unintended consequences. Anyway, it was absolutely the greatest thing we ever did. And so my point was, they're so lost in their own heads. Our economy has been destroyed. We've lost and committed horrible atrocities throughout the Middle East in the last 20, 30, arguably 40 years. And now we want this big victory, just like we got after we destroyed the economy and killed 3 million or more people in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So now we're trying to get another proxy war victory off against Russia. The difference is Afghanistan is thousands of miles from Russia. And similarly, Vietnam was, many thousands of miles away from the United States. This is replicating that same cyclone strategy on NATO and Russia's borders. And according to James Carden, we were talking about earlier, he says he spoke with high-level military officials, intelligence officials, and diplomats who told him that there are U.S. paramilitaries on the ground right now. And in fact, the Russians just said, look, Medvedev, I believe what it was. It's on antiwar.com this weekend. He goes, we are way closer to nuclear war than ever before. And he said that if you continue to, flood the country with weapons, train these Ukrainian forces on how to use these NATO weapons, deploy mercenaries, and, continue to, let's see, what is it, the full quote? The dispatch and conduct all these exercises like we were talking about earlier near our borders. All this increases the likelihood of a direct and open conflict between NATO and Russia instead of their war by proxy. Such a conflict always has the risk of turning into a full-fledged nuclear war. This will be a disastrous scenario for everyone. And as Dave points out, Dave DeCamp here, he talks about Adam Kinzinger's AUMF, which we did earlier, and just the fact that the American ruling class and the NATO hawks, people like Boris Johnson and leaders of these Baltic states and Poland, or Lithuania, who just called for regime change and said not just of Putin but his whole government, that has to be the ending. That has to be the end game here, is full-fledged regime change of that whole government in Moscow, and you can't do that if they push. Like I said, I mean, I just think that since we already have British troops on the ground training the Ukrainians in Kiev how to use these NLAWs, these anti-tank weapons, I think we're going to see – I think that's almost like a canary in the coal mine, that they're trying to test the waters to see how far they can push it. Maybe we bring in some NATO troops into the very far west of Ukraine, or because they're not – the Russians so far have not hit Poland or these supply lines coming in from these Eastern European countries near the border, particularly Poland. Right. So they haven't done that. But the more casualties they inflict on Russia, the worse the economic war gets. And the more they keep hyping how involved they are when they brag about, taking out flagships and Russian generals and all this. And they shot down a Russian transport plane recently with hundreds of Russian troops on it. And then it was bragged about in the press in NBC News. I think was who broke the story, where they're like, yep, that was our intelligence. So I mean, I honestly, I don't know. I don't think Putin and these guys bluff as much as the Americans do. I think we need to take the threat extremely seriously, which is why, like we were talking about Rand, it's just not strong enough to say I'm going to have an inspector general look at this, at the money and see where it's going. And if we're not being wasteful here or something, there has to be a mass movement to change this, because I don't know. I doubt, Milley says this is going to go on for years and years and years. I doubt that's feasible without a major direct conflict at a minimum. But on the other hand, Ted Carpenter had a piece that came out this week that could somewhat put our minds at ease, because he suggests that, if you look at the pertinent wording in Article 5 of the NATO Charter, it does appear that these policies that are being enacted by NATO states kind of fall within range of Article 5. It doesn't necessarily suggest that we have to go to nuclear war. It says that if you impose a bunch of sanctions on Russia, that could be your way of supporting your ally or your partner. And this could even be what they do if, say, Russia went into Poland or something. We'd send them a bunch of weapons, provide intelligence, train troops outside of the country, and maybe send some advisors or troops like the British have, and I guess get away with it possibly the way it has been so far. Maybe there's a range of things that they could do by sending in more weapons and like we said, intelligence and all this stuff. But I don't know, because the British, it was the Armed Services Minister, or the Deputy Minister for the Armed Forces, came out recently and said, we encourage attacks on Russian territory, and it's completely legitimate. And if you're going to use British weapons to do it, that would no problem. These are the quotes. And I just, that keeps increasing as time goes on, these attacks inside Russia. In fact, actually, the first person who was killed in one such alleged attack that just happened recently. It's up again. I think there's an article about it on antiwar.com this weekend. It was in Belgorod, which has been attacked a couple of times, just about a dozen miles off the Ukrainian border. And so I mean, honestly, I think that they are absolutely pushing the envelope. And most articles, or at least the last one, that look, if the shoe was on the other foot, we would have already pulled the trigger on the nukes. I don't see that. And listen, if NATO is willing to just do this kind of stuff and they wouldn't go to nuclear war, even if, say, the Baltic states got attacked or something, which I don't think there's any reason to expect that to happen yet. But if they keep pushing it, who knows how the Russians have warned that the war is going to expand if they continue pouring weapons into the country, and it will destabilize Europe. And now that they're bringing in Finland and Sweden into NATO and expanding the border with Russia by about 800 miles, nearly doubling it, Medvedev, I believe, has already come out and said, look, we're going to reinforce the Baltics with and the Gulf of Finland with additional air and land and sea forces. But not only that, we're going to bring in more nuclear weapons into the theater and potentially hypersonics as well. But the only person who seems to be standing in the way of this expansion is Erdogan, is the leader of Turkey. And he's saying, because his whole thing is that, they fund terrorist groups, Finland and Sweden. We're not very happy about this. It's not exactly clear who he's talking about. He could be talking about the Kurds and Western support for the Kurds in Syria. But regardless, I don't care what his reason is. If he stops that would actually be very good news. But I don't know. Who knows if that'll actually work. But it's a very the provocations are just endless, and it's very difficult just to keep track. And as you said, there is no one hitting the brakes, and the way it works is no matter what Biden will do, the Republicans will say he's not doing it. The establishment Republicans will say that he's not doing enough. The other ones who say that they're against all this and vote against this legislation so that they can say the real focus is China. That does seem to me like some kind of sick game where they cover their bases. So it doesn't look like I'm not a neocon. I just want to go to war with China. but it's evenly distributed. I just don't think they sell McCain's or Hillary's anymore. I don't think that works. People see through that way too easily. It's why a lot of people who are neocon adjacent or former neocons use the word as a pejorative now. To try and get the heat off. But I do think we're very, very close. What is your expectation as far as the likelihood of things really getting out of control here very soon?
I don't know. To me, it's hard to judge. The thing that concerns me the most is that people just don't seem to care. Some people care. If they do care, they care about Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. But I mean, for as close as we are, you would think that there would be more expression of concern in the public. Like, we were, again, objectively, we might be closer now to nuclear war than we ever have been in our entire world history. But even in the past, you had a whole culture built around fear of the atomic blast, and maybe that was as a result of a PR campaign or some kind of propaganda in the United States. But it certainly was a real risk then. I mean, do you remember there was a standoff between U.S. and Russian tanks in Germany in Berlin at one point in time at Checkpoint Charlie or something like that in the 50s? And they had tanks with their guns pointed at each other, just itching to press the trigger, So, I mean, I would consider that to be pretty damn close. And so I don't know. It's just surreal. The whole thing is incredibly surreal. And I think that people stand around thinking because it feels so surreal, they don't realize the true danger of it, maybe, or just the incredible hubris of our leaders, our so-called leaders. I try not to be a downer.
They've gotten the majority of the population, I would say, to either be complacent or literally, I mean, this is a real novel invention, to get people to support these because you're right, the fear of nuclear war was a way of justifying these Cold War policies. But at the end of that, there were these drastic mutual reductions in the nuclear stockpile from the tens of thousands down to those relatively low numbers we have today. And that was led by Gorbachev and people like, frankly, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, which is hard to believe because a lot of these treaties that George W. Bush and Donald Trump have ripped up and Biden has refused to re-enter were either Eisenhower's idea originally or something Nixon negotiated or something Reagan negotiated or George H.W. Bush. So the Republicans we have today are just a completely different species, even from the guys who led the Cold War. They're way more hawkish. They have they're absolutely, it's an anathema to have some kind of arms treaty. Like I am absolutely convinced that New START wouldn't have even been that 5-year extension. And who knows if that's gonna be renewed, right? Or if there's gonna be some sort of a replacement. I was shocked when Biden did it because I expected him to be horrible on Russia, and that's frankly the only good thing he did on the whole thing. But yeah, they've gotten Americans to actually support policies with both Russia and China that could inevitably lead to nuclear war. But they either they don't think about it. I honestly, to this day, like the way it's just casually tossed around. Somebody's got to crack down on China, get tough on China. And all this stuff about Russia that we've got to people hate them so much. And it's largely because of Russiagate, but they want that country destroyed. They want them we have projected all of our crimes and insecurities and shame and guilt and complicity in our rulers' crimes onto the Russian people. And it's my belief that we're really making the idea is we're going to make them pay for what we've done. It's just insane to want to just I'm sure the Democratic Party and their constituents would support this idea of regime change. There's people who are saying, I can't say it here, but really horrible things about Rand Paul for doing what he just did. Because it's never enough. Was it Tom Massey who just came out and said we're spending $500 per family on weapons and aid to Ukraine at a time of 40-year high inflation rates and rocketing gas prices and shelves that aren't full on grocery store shelves and the baby formula shortage and all this. And this is all about we hate Russia so much and we run the world. And it can be no other way that this has to be it was McConnell who just came out and said this is the most important thing in the world today. Yeah. The American people are just being kicked in the where every step of the way here. And their whole lives are in the crosshairs of nuclear war because of Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken and Victoria Nuland and Jake Sullivan and Lloyd Austin, who walks off the board of Raytheon to be defense secretary. It's awful. The way that they have committed us to world war with China over uninhibited islands in the East China Sea most people don't know exist, or the Spratly Islands, the Whitsun Reef for the Philippines. Again, it's just absolutely mind-boggling.
And Stavridis is, in my piece, I think I included some kind of thing where he talked about the Senkaku Islands and how vitally important these islands are. I mean, and
he just go. He's like, well, there's so much trade.
Yeah.
It's like, or does he add more to that? Yeah, when I read your piece, the quotes I saw, it sounds like at the end of the day, they have very little to lean on to make these cases. So they end up saying, well, it's such an important, center for trade.
Yeah, because of course, I mean, if China takes over the trade lanes, what they're going to do is they're going to halt global trade, right? I mean,
that's how you get rich.
Yes, that'd be in their best interest to make sure that no one trades in those trading corridors, or that the United States doesn't, even though, I mean, aren't we their number one trading partner?
I believe so, yeah. And they're the number one trading partner in goods for Europe, I believe.
Yeah.
Or with the EU anyway. And then the funny thing too is I think it was Abdel Bariatwan from Al-Quds Al-Arabi that interviewed bin Laden, and he asked him about that stuff about the idea that if the wrong regime gets in power, they'll just hoard all the oil in the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Peninsula.
Yeah.
And he goes, well, we're not going to drink it. So, and Stockman this is all in enough already. Scott's book. I mean, there's great quotes from David Stockman about this, that it's just such a lunatic argument to make that we have to control these sea lanes and these trade routes militarily, no matter what. Otherwise, there'll be no free trade.
Right. Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense. Only if you're trying to justify these massive expenditures, like I mentioned earlier, trillions of dollars that are unnecessarily spent. But that money all goes to the Pentagon. It goes to the military. The guys making the subs and the destroyers and the cruisers and all this and all the weapons that are on inside. And it's just disgusting.
Yeah. Or even the semiconductors too. I mean, it's just like,
right.
What is China going to do? Eat them?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And also just logically, and I haven't gotten a good answer on why people don't understand this. So you're talking about going to war then to protect the semiconductors. If there's a war on, first of all, it's like Ukraine, right?
Connor, no one wants a war with China. No one is advocating for a war with China. You don't understand.
I know. No one's advocating for war with Iraq. It's not like that. I just want to make sure that Saddam, we got to go in there and inspect the weapons. That's like you said with the Biden AUMF and O2. If you go to war with China over Taiwan, or you go in to defend Taiwan or whatever this is, and I argue that, and you would too, I believe that U.S. policy is the most the likelihood of a war going essentially depends on the extent of U.S. intervention in Taiwan. And quite frankly, the escalations under Biden of just openly boasting about having a troop presence on the island, that we're training them, again, like with the NATO stuff, it's like there's no illusions that we're training them for war with the mainland, eventual war with the mainland. And we said the naval and air presence is vastly increased. So we are making this much more of a likely possibility than otherwise. And if you're trying to protect the semiconductor supply, wouldn't a war endanger the supply? It seems to me that would be one of the
destroy the factories.
Yeah, it would be one of the. I mean, the argument then should be to make some kind of help. China as Peter Van Buren has talked about extensively, their interest is in reunifying the two Chinas. Let's say it's not two Chinas, but reunifying with the island of Taiwan peacefully. So it's not in the interest of them to go and they don't have frankly the military capabilities to pull that off right now anyway, except unless maybe they did some sort of air campaign on the island or something like that. It's not what people envision. They just do not have the ability to do an amphibious invasion of the style that we imagine in our heads of taking the island or something like that. So, and it would be a much more intricate thing with special forces, and they'd have to shut off hit infrastructure real fast before. Daniel Davis is a real expert on this and has some articles about how this would all look, but it just doesn't stand a reason that you would go in and start a war in order to protect the semiconductors when they're going to get destroyed. They're going to get destroyed anyway. So you have to make sure that, again, China, like Russia, has an off ramp here. And the truth is, at the end of the day, we use things like and Wolfowitz. Actually, Gareth Porter has a really great piece about Randall Schreiber and from his position in the Pentagon under the Trump administration and his connections through Wolfowitz and people like that with and Richard Armitage, that they even before they were explaining this, I believe at the Taiwan representative office or the de facto embassy we have there, where they say we used to fear that Taiwan was an issue that could sour relations with China. And we tried to sort of balance that. That was the policy. But now we see Taiwan as a way of countering China in the Indo-Pacific. And so now, they are just doubling down and using the Taiwan issue as a way of essentially stoking tensions with China and provoking them. And that's as much admitted as a real policy even before that was, revealed officially in this piece, that was what they had in mind with these arms sales that they have been trying to get through for decades. In this article, Gareth explains that, I believe, with some quotes specifically from Wolfowitz about that. But I'll just say that, Ukraine and Taiwan and these things, it's not, as we saw with Ukraine, there's a lot of reason to believe and a lot of evidence to suggest that the U.S. wanted Putin to invade and that they were goading him. And at some point there was a change in the policy where they decided that was what they wanted to have. They wanted to see. And I'm not unconvinced that they're not trying to push China to do something stupid and attack Taiwan. And at this point, again, it's still the strategic ambiguity. But when we see stuff like that on the State Department website, it does put serious doubt into the idea of how directly the U.S. would intervene in a situation like that. But it is our policy that's making an attack on Taiwan much more likely, just like what happened in Ukraine. So
I just wanted to highlight, you mentioned that article by Randall Shriver. I did by Gareth Porter about Randall Shriver and the Project 2049 Institute. I did a deep dive on that in episode 211. And I mean, I pretty much almost read it word for word because there's so much information in it. But I think if you guys go back and you can read that episode or read the article. And I also I looked into another piece on the 2049 Institute and which actually had information, Connor, that Gareth Porter didn't cover and didn't include, not specifically on Shriver, but on 2049 itself. So that I think that should be a good resource for you guys to learn more about what Project 2049 is, because they're the main conduit. They're the main think tank facilitating these arms sales to Taiwan. And there was another thing that I had there was an analyst from the Project 2049 Institute himself that said and basically admitted that a Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan would happen on a scale that would make it seemingly impossible unless there was some kind of a clandestine, cut the head off the snake, very limited military engagement.
Interesting.
I'm trying to find that freaking.
It's weird when the Hawks admit little bits of truth like that sort of go against the main narrative. I just read a quote from Ned Price recently where he's talking about how by leaving the Iran deal and adding the IRGC to that foreign terrorist organization blacklist, which his boss is refusing to change, he goes, well, this is really put U.S. troops in danger in Iraq and Syria. He's like, these attacks from these Shiite militias, it's gone up 400% since 2018 when Trump left the deal. He goes, and that's happened because of the murder of the assassination of General Soleimani, and this foreign terrorist organization blacklist. He says these are some of the main factors. And then there's just no self-awareness that, well, then why aren't you announcing as well that we are in fact removing them from said blacklist? Because he points out, he's like, between 2012 and 2018, there were no such attacks on American troops in these regions. It's just totally wild. Because 2049, their main interest with their benefactors is to ensure that more and more weapons continue to be purchased. It's been a while since I looked at what military contractors back them, but I know Gareth does go through some of that in the piece, and I think also as well as Armitage International. The group that preceded it, which is kind of a similar organization, but certainly not as powerful as 2049 ultimately became.
Yeah, dude. And as we keep talking, I keep thinking of things that I want to touch on. So we're running long here, but I'm really enjoying this conversation. So
me too.
Thanks, listeners. All right. So I wanted to play you this video of Lindsey Graham talking about poo-pooing poo-pooing the use of nuclear weapons, and because I think it goes along with what we were kind of talking about in terms of what the rhetoric is. And I'm just gonna jump in because at some point he kind of talks about it.
Okay.
Let's see here. Okay. Oh, and I hope
I couldn't hear it on the
Well, I
last
think
video.
I see. Okay, let me figure that out so we can make sure that you can comment on it.
Cool.
Okay, so that should be working here. I'm just gonna pull it up quick.
Cool.
think we're maybe heading that direction. We're not going to have a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia because the Russian general staff won't let that happen. That would be suicide for the Russian people. And if you're looking for scum and traitors in Russia, Putin, look in the mirror. You're the scum, you're the traitor, you're the guy that should be facing criminal charges or be taken out. But when it comes to tactical nuclear weapons, I can actually envision for the first time, because he's so desperate, the use of a tactical nuke to scare everybody off and try to get a settlement favorable to him. And here's what I would say. If he uses a tactical nuclear weapon inside Ukraine, I would consider that an Article 5 breach, because the radiation will flow outside the Ukraine and it will pollute our neighboring NATO allies. So a nuclear explosion in the Ukraine would affect the entire region, NATO members, and I would consider that an Article 5 event, an attack on NATO itself. If he uses chemical weapons, I would consider that a reason to change the no-fly status. The one thing I can tell you about Putin, when he hears that you're afraid of him, that you don't want to make him mad, you don't want to anger him, that's like a shot of steroids. What he fears is not a great speech by Zelensky, which it was a great speech, but the javelins, the stingers, and the MiGs. When you punch him in the nose is the best way to deal with this guy. And I am telling you right now, that speech yesterday, along with the call for Syrian fighters to supplement his army, tells me that things are not going well for him and that Ukraine can win. The Biden administration needs to embrace the thought that the Ukraine can win. Their whole strategy has been around Putin winning quickly. Well, he's not going to win quickly. I'm all in for the Ukraine.
Senator Gray.
Okay, yeah. So he goes on a different topic after that, but I wanted to get some of your thoughts on that. And we get an example here of how they're just, I say he kind of writes off the possibility of, well, he does. I mean, right at the beginning, he writes that off, but then talks about a situation where he thinks that Putin will, but it's all encapsulated in this idea that things are not going very well for the Russians.
Yeah, it's, well, I just don't believe guys like him are sincere, but I think that he could get us all killed. Like, in other words, I just don't believe a guy who's supported as many wars as he has and as many deaths as he's arguably responsible for from his perch in the U.S. Senate, that this guy really is just broken up emotionally over an attack on Ukraine and the violation of the territorial integrity and national sovereignty. But nevertheless, that's not really the point. The argument we're hearing a lot more is from people like Michael McFaul, Hawks. There was even a piece written in the Wall Street Journal recently where they say, we ought to demonstrate that we can win a nuclear war with Russia. And so we ought to start hitting, I believe they said, hit their nuclear subs and then hit their second strike capabilities and this sort of thing, and just set the tone and let them know, like, presumably they'll back off if we do that and run away scared. I mean, that's what he's saying when he goes, well, punch him in the nose and all this. The problem is when he's the same guy we said earlier that his big quote was, he's getting no off ramp, take him out. So when he says all this stuff, it's very difficult to tell if he wants to see this actually happen. And at first he says he's not going to use nukes, but he may use nukes. It would just be the tactical nukes. Well, we've already deployed low-yield so-called tactical nuclear weapons, and it was considered a massive escalation at the time, because these are supposed to be the more usable nuclear weapons that can actually be used in combat. And they're not the kind of, they're not like the city killer nuclear bombs we think of when we think about nuclear weapons. And it's just ridiculous. I mean, the policy that they have enacted is what is making this more and more of a distinct possibility. And everything else he says in that clip would provoke Putin to feel further backed into a corner and to do, when he says he wants them to win, someone should sit Graham down and ask him what he considers winning. Does winning include not losing 100,000 people and making some sort of settlement, or maybe hopefully well less than that, and making an agreement over Crimea and the Donbass and neutrality? Because Graham is absolutely opposed to that. And we know that when Zelensky got close to making an agreement like that, Boris Johnson went and visited him in April. This has just come out recently in Ukraine and Pravda and elsewhere now. It's being reported all over at this point, but that Boris Johnson said to him, hey, you might be ready to make a deal with the Russians, but we're not. Speaking for the West, speaking for himself, the United States, and the so-called some NATO member states that the Turkish foreign minister was referring to, or Washington Post was referring to, when they said, we don't want this thing to end anytime soon. We prefer to see Ukrainians fighting and dying. And Johnson apparently told him that this is our opportunity to press Putin. He is not to be negotiated with. He is to be pressured. And they're just not going to accept this thing winding down until they are satisfied with the damage done to Russia. And like Chas Freeman said, that could mean decades of nuclear brinksmanship, or that could mean, like Milley has said, that it goes on for years and years. He goes, I'm not going to measure it in decades, but certainly years and years. He said that to the House Armed Services Committee, and nobody stood up and said, you should be fired for this, because we're all now at the risk of nuclear war. And but no, you know what Cardin said in his piece, again, to refer back, is he says that the mood right now in Washington is that they're all terrified of not doing enough. So imagine how bad everything is right now, that after all of this, the big concern is I'm going to look weak. I'm going to look bad, like I'm not doing enough. So Pelosi, when she went to Ukraine recently, she said, and she went with Barbara Lee, which is a real disappointment, and Adam Schiff and Jason Crow, and they said, we're in it to win it, and we're not stopping until there's a victory here, right? And so I don't know. I mean, you heard him. I'm back in Ukraine, like I don't know, what is it, a soccer game or something? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I just don't know either, because they say, well, the scenario in which we envision Putin using a tactical nuclear weapon is a scenario in which he feels like he's backed into a corner and he's going to lose, right? So
yeah. We're in it to win it.
We're in it to win it. Yeah.
There's and it's not even a disconnect. I wish it was. I wish it was like, they're not thinking this through.
Yeah.
The problem is, what if, okay, they do not have the same interests we do.
Right.
And I don't think the broad American public really does understand what's going on here. And I got to tell you, I am so disturbed by this constant pressure that if someone brings up nuclear war, you're automatically, I mean, you heard his framing. When you do that, you're just aiding him.
Yeah.
Like you're just a pussy, basically. You're just a Kremlin stooge. You're just a pansy, what they used to call a pansy liberal. Guess you can't really do that now, since only the Republicans are the ones voting against these bills. But basically, yeah, you can't even talk about that. You can't talk about, he says in Washington that it's a taboo. You're not allowed to talk about what we did to get here, and you're not allowed to talk about the risk of nuclear war. You're only allowed to talk about what more we can do. And the American people are just not willing to. My personal theory is that we would probably let nuclear war happen before we actually stopped our leaders from starting a nuclear conflict, because it's honestly because it's too much. It's easier. It would be, we act like Putin should be on trial for war crimes. Yeah, but like, there is no real incentive. I mean, we're not incentive, but there's no will on the part of the American public to bring people like even George W. Bush, let alone Biden right now, who's arguably even worse considering the consequences of what he's doing. This is still all George W. Bush and Bill Clinton's fault, but for their policies on Russia going back to the 90s and the 2000s. But nevertheless, there's just nobody cares. I mean, they would literally let themselves all get vaporized before saying, hey, we're putting our foot down on with Putin. No, with you, with Washington, with this whole, I mean, just the idea that we are like Massey said, just burning money to bleed Russia and destroy them, because that's always been Victoria Nuland's dream, right? That's just, it's so disgusting. And nobody's allowed to, there's so many distractions. I appreciate that people are really invested in domestic politics, but the fact that we're over here talking about abortion and trans people and Will Smith slapping Chris Rock at the Oscars, it's kind of crazy. It's just kind of crazy to see the disconnect on the part of the public. Like you said, I don't know if they're totally aware of exactly what's going on here.
Yeah, and the brinksmanship, to kind of poke a stick at our friends on the more populist right, I think I've seen some people like making fun of those anti-war libertarians who think that abortion is a distraction from the risk of nuclear annihilation. like somehow we don't care about, like, I don't know how many kids have been aborted since, Roe v. Wade or something. It's something that people will say, but I mean, we're talking
nuclear war would mean a lot of late-term abortions.
Late-term abortions, Connor.
So, I don't know. I love when anybody does that, when they're like, a lot of libertarians. I don't think you can really play down the COVID regime and what actually happened there. But the idea that it was just kind of said by, people who should have known better, they were like, I let foreign policy take the back seat, because I figure they're always going to be wrong about that. And I'm focusing on this. You're like, okay, but for the guys that are paying attention to it, they're like, holy shit, look at what's going on around China and around Russia right now. This could be really bad. And then now look what's happening here. I don't think that I just think that we really need to, as the American people, and just as the libertarian movement in general, I still think the best thing we have going for us is talking about foreign policy and about money and the Federal Reserve and the economy. It's old school Ron Paul stuff, although I think that's essentially what Dave and the Mises Caucus are going to be doing here going forward. But that really is it. And we just have to – people have to understand that just despite what Lindsey Graham, of all people, and Antony Blinken tell you, this is not our business, and we caused these problems in the first place, and we are not risking nuclear war. I love when people go, oh, you wouldn't risk war over Estonia because you think it doesn't matter. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not even sure if we should go to nuclear war over – well, first of all, I am saying that, by the way. But I'm not saying that we should go to nuclear war over London or Washington. I don't understand how this became – I mean, I get it. But like in theory, mutually assured destruction is a good thing. And the problem is you really should abolish the weapons, because clearly nobody is responsible enough to have these things. Well,
so how quickly we would just – seemingly resort to that option too. I mean, it seems like, okay, well, any massive conflict in this day and age would last a couple weeks until someone would be like, you know what, fuck it, bink. I'm
in it to win it.
Yeah.
It's wild, because the thing is too, of course, with the argument is not that Putin did the right thing. The point when you compare it to the Cuban Missile Crisis is to say, what would the Americans do on the other foot? Doug Bandow is an expert with these analogies that he does about the Western Hemisphere, and comparing it if the Soviets expanded the Warsaw Pact up from Latin America, and then did a street putsch in Mexico, or started a war in Honduras and broke off a piece of it unilaterally, bypassing the Security Council and America's veto power, and then they did a Nazi street putsch in Mexico, and then basically put in place removed a U.S. friendly government, and then put in their puppets, and then directed trade southward away from the United States, and then trained them and built their military up to be in this case, if you look at Ukraine, I mean, it's pretty crazy. They went from after the coup, if Putin wanted to, he could have just annexed probably the country, if not east of the Dnieper River, and certainly could have taken the Donbass. Like Scott says, he could just taken a magic marker and drawn a line, said this is Russia now. But if they didn't do it. And strategically, that may have been, if you're just looking at it from their eyes, it might have been a mistake. In fact, it sounds like a lot of the hardliners in the military were very critical of Putin for waiting so long and losing the better chances that they would have had a more swift and decided victory.
Yeah.
Decisive victory. But Ukraine is now the largest military in Europe after Russia, so it's a very different scenario. But just imagine if they did that in Mexico or something and threatened us. You have the whole time. Let's say the Russians have some organization like the NED, and the Russians are launching all these sanctions on America and clearly have this de facto policy of regime change here. And they're cutting off all diplomacy, ripping up all the arms treaties we used to have. And then they say, by the way, you're going to be on the end of one of these regime changes soon, which is what Carl Gershman said in the Washington Post in 2013, the head of the NED, right before the coup in Ukraine.
I've been thinking about that analogy you said that Doug Bando put forward, right? Let's extend it just a little bit too. What if Texas never really succeeded in becoming an independent state and there were a bunch of Texans, that was part of Mexico, right? And then they overthrow the U.S. friendly government in Mexico City, and there's a bunch of Texans living in Mexico who are Texans, and that new government in Mexico starts a civil war, because the Texans want to secede from Mexico, perhaps, and the formerly U.S. friendly government in Mexico City starts a civil war against them, and then the United States now wants to say, well, we should go in and protect those Texans, or something like that. And
I'm sure the Americans would be saying that's a violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty. We can't do that.
Yeah.
Again, not justifying it, but just we would never accept this stuff. The mentality is that screw Russia. They don't get to have we can do whatever we want, and they're just going to have to eat it. Because we would never. They're taking this whole military alliance. They're literally training for war with like dozens and dozens and dozens of exercises, right? Either on their doorstep or in their near abroad. And it's just, that's normal. That's what we do. That's just completely accepted. And the idea that we would ever let anything like that happen is just completely absurd. And so, and then the other thing too is in the Donbass, at least before the war, there were hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens in that region, in the Donbass. So your analogy is exactly correct. It's entirely apropos. These were. It wasn't that he was just going in there to protect, the ethnic Russian population. He legitimately, there's hundreds of thousands of Russian civilians in that area, and there had been shelling that had made its way across the border in the past during the previous 8-year war. And again, we haven't even mentioned yet that Ukraine led a war on terror that was backed by the U.S. with training CIA paramilitaries on the ground, advising these militants, including I haven't seen too much detail on all this yet, but certainly the spearhead of that war were the Nazis, Azov Battalion and the others. And 14,000 people got killed in that war. And that's a low ball estimate. So again, the Russian argument is that they were intervening in the midst of a war, not starting a whole new one. But again, we're not allowed to talk about what came before, according to the corporate press, the intelligentsia, and the deep state, and all these, which is super convenient. Obviously, you were never, I'll never forget Bill O'Reilly saying to Ron Paul, when I think he's talking to him about Iran and the chances of them, because this makes total sense that they would hand a nuclear weapon when they don't have off to Hezbollah to go and attack the United States, which they haven't done since we invaded Lebanon, and they'll use a nuke because they have surrogates. That's what the latest talking points from whatever think tank Bill was getting his rhetoric from at the time. He starts yelling at Ron Paul. He goes, "Surrogates? if you don't think that Iran has surrogates that could do a nuclear attack in the United States with one, you're living in the land of Oz, Congressman. It's one of my favorite lines of all time. But anyway, Ron Paul tries to explain to him, I think it's about Saddam. He says, or no, that's with Hannity. I've seen too many of these. It's something about Iran, and he's talking to him about the Iran-Iraq War and Operation Ajax. He's trying to get this information in the 5-minute segment. And Bill O'Reilly starts yelling at him, we don't need a history lesson. We don't need a history lesson tonight. And he's just, talking about whatever the policy the Bush administration was proposing at that very time, probably more sanctions. And I know that they had done the global designation of the IRGC, or the Quds Force, as a global terrorist organization. It's been a while since I've seen the clip, but typical, whatever the the neocon policy was. They came pretty close actually to starting a war with Iran at the end of the Bush administration. Of course, Cheney was heavily involved in that, but Cheney was very close to starting a war with Russia in 2008 when they promised at Bucharest in 2004 in April that Georgia and Ukraine would eventually be members in NATO, even though the French and the Germans went absolutely ballistic over it, particularly the Germans. The Bush's his compromise was, well, okay, so they won't get that membership action plan, but they're on a fast track to getting it, and they'll eventually be a part of NATO. The fast track, we're still on the fast track, right? So the Germans and the French, for all intents and purposes, at least for now, has successfully blocked that. But the Russians have no reason to expect that that's the case. And because, of course, it was previously unprecedented that they would ever do what they've already done, taking in the Baltics, for instance. But anyway, they promised Tbilisi NATO membership and started providing military assistance to them after, we backed the Rose Revolution, a color revolution in Russia where Saakashvili took power. And then I guess if you read Andrew Coburn and Scott's work on this as well, and Andrew has obviously real sources on all this that he reported on, that they were getting back channels from the Cheney government. I mean, from the Cheney's office, like his guys were telling Saakashvili, we'll probably defend you. Yeah, you could count on us, man. And then he goes and he attacks Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia, in this breakaway province where there's an EU brokered deal about basically that they maintain their autonomy here, and that the Russian peacekeepers are there protecting them. And it was a U.S. backed deal negotiated by the European Union. And so Saakashvili attacks these Russian forces and they take casualties. So then the Russians, they hit back hard. They came very close to, just outside the capital, and they reversed that very quickly and secured the autonomy of the South Ossetians. But in the midst of all that, they're sending armor and infantry in the Roki Tunnel under the Caucasus Mountains. And Cheney's going, well, let's launch some missile strikes, crush it, so bring it down on top of all of them and kill them all. Jesus. And and so actually Andrew has a piece I cite in Cold War Served Hot about this, where he talks about how I think it's Stephen Hadley and Condoleezza Rice had to literally basically maintain constant surveillance on Cheney to see whenever he would go into the Oval Office to talk to Bush, because they were terrified that Bush would just get swayed by him at some point when Cheney could get him alone or something. And so they had to have somebody there at all times to get in there to go, no, that's a bad idea. George, don't listen to him. So then eventually I think it was Hadley who said, does anybody here agree with Vice? And nobody raised their hand, except of course Cheney. And it ultimately didn't happen. But there, John McCain, I think, was actually making some of the same calls. He was running for president, coming out and pledging support and saying, we are all Georgians now. And so, yeah, it's just they have been looking for something like this for a very long time. And I think Ukraine was the one. They knew that's the biggest thing too, is like, when they of course they don't want to talk about the past. If you talk about "niet" means "niet," forget whether you think it's justified. They knew that Russia had told them that this was the brightest of all red lines. Actually, that might have been a separate cable that William Burns, the CIA director now, formerly the ambassador of Russia, sent to Condoleezza Rice. But he did say in the other one, look, I spoke to Lavrov, and Lavrov told me no means no. You will not bring Ukraine to NATO. If you do that, it's going to spark a civil war. Check. and we will be forced to decide if we have to intervene in that case militarily. Check. So don't do it. Don't put us in that situation where we have to make this decision. And separately, I believe Burns had told Rice and written in his books that virtually every member of the Russian political elite and establishment that I've spoken to across the whole spectrum, from Putin's most ardent liberal critic to the worst kind of knuckle dragger in the dark recesses of the Kremlin, holdover from the last Cold War, none of them view, Ukrainian membership in NATO as anything other than virtually an existential threat, a direct threat to Russia's national security. So they knew it. They knew it's like when we go, poking the bear. That is the policy at this point. Like, it's just to keep sticking them in the eyes again and again and again. It's incredible that we're just there doesn't seem to be. That's the biggest problem, is we don't have a real constituency that has any kind of power other than these token votes. And to your point about how much of the populist right is in on this, but they're all like China hawks. In the meantime, they're getting all these pats on the head and the back, and everybody's like, "Oh, isn't this great?" Everybody loves attacking the Democrats for being hawks, and believe me, I do too. But just because these guys are making these votes that are ultimately inconsequential, Massey I give absolute credit to in this case, just like I would Ron Paul, even if he's the lone vote. I really appreciate that because that guy's got principle. But in this case, it's just weird that we're like, it's not changing anything, but we're really glad to see it. And I get that. But yeah. I wish there was a group that could actually say, we're actually not just blocking this thing and starting some sort of have an inspector general to look through the fine print. We're not allowing this to happen. This has to stop.
Yeah.
But they want to destroy. They obviously do. I mean, that stuff about great power competition. It'd be so great if it was just a welfare scheme for the military-industrial complex. What did Peter Schiff say? If it's just about that, then I think he was saying that he was making the point that militarism is so detrimental to the economy, and it's not a net benefit. It's only a benefit to the special interests, and it hurts everybody else drastically. But I think his point was, if you took, U.S. and Japanese ships out into the middle of the Pacific and just they destroyed each other, but they were like, okay, but the money's already been spent, and it's good for the economy, right? He's like, but by the same token, it's certainly not good for the economy. But at the same time, they don't have to start these wars. They could just take our money and we could bring the troops home if that's the kind of dictatorship we're living under and they have that much power. But they really do have an ideological commitment to ensuring to repressing the rise of China, which they've been talking about for a very long time. I mean, I found references to the Asia pivot, a rough sketch of it in PNAC's Rebuilding Defenses, where they go, we're going to send 2/3 of the carrier fleet to the Asia Pacific to prepare for to combat the rise of China, or however they phrase it. Admittedly, they said the carriers, but in the actual Asia pivot itself, Obama's saying, I'm moving 2/3 of all air and naval forces. I'm like, where did they get that figure? 2/3? It just seems odd that PNAC would hit that first, and that they're already talking about it. And then, as we talk about the Wolfowitz stuff, they're ideologically committed to really taking down Russia and China. So I mean, it's just not. It's unfortunate that I think the neoconservatives infected the national consciousness in such a way in the Bush years that. And then really with Russiagate and Obama bringing so many of that, like rebranding it, and it's been rebranded again, arguably under Trump, and now it's being rebranded again. And I'm not saying that they're all core ideological neocons, in the school of Irving Kristol and Leo Strauss specifically, and there's always been a debate over what constitutes a real neocon, but largely speaking, this whole idea of American benevolent global hegemony and the idea that it is our mandate to defend the world from Russia and China, even if it means going to war, that's been so largely accepted at this point that it is the consensus. and they find clever ways of getting people to get on board with it for different demographics. But for the most part, yeah, people are just completely committed to this idea that, well, you got to do something about China. And the other half of the country says you need regime change in Moscow. So I don't see it going well unless the American people can. And I've said this before, with the mandates and everything like this, or even the nonsense about the election, either way, the freak out after 2016 or the I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about the real legitimacy of this previous. It wouldn't surprise me if there was a lot of corruption going on and that the thing was rigged or whatever. But I'm just saying that there should be massive protests, general strikes. There should be people in the military going AWOL and resigning and refusing to be tripwire forces or training the Ukrainians. There should it should be people should be refusing even to pay. Maybe we shouldn't even say this, but there should be talk about at what point do we say we're not paying for this anymore? Because it's just, if we don't hit the brakes, they're not going to. So we could all die. And at that point, all this other talk about, which bathroom is which and all the other, domestic squabbles, which I get, it's important, but in the abstract, it looks really stupid when you consider that we're dancing on this edge right now of nuclear war or not.
Well, I try to be a happy warrior, Connor. I try to be, but it's hard for me personally because I just don't. I mean, there's this feeling of momentum and inertia in a certain direction, and it just seems very hopeless to me. I mean, to be completely honest, and it's like, well, I don't know what else to do other than what I'm doing and trying to raise my family and do all those things and do this when I can. But like I said, it feels like there's this momentum and a feeling of helplessness in terms of, I mean, what's going to happen is going to happen. And I guess maybe there's some sense of peace there. It's like, well, I'm going to do what I can, but the cards are going to fall where they may.
I think the best, one of the things that really makes me somewhat optimistic is people. Okay, this could go both. So much of this stuff is it's like a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
So at the same time that, okay, I think Biden's disapproval ratings are probably way lower than we even know. I've never seen people can act like, okay, I'll just say it. I think people have way less faith in Biden than they did in Trump. Even the people that hated Trump nominally, the worst kind of Trump haters or whatever, I just don't think they saw him as incompetent and as bad and feckless and just ultimately a disaster as they do with Biden, even if they don't admit it. The other problem with that is that it makes all these claims that he's weak and not doing enough with whatever it is, Russia or China, it makes them have such more validity when that shouldn't be the case. If you just look at the policy, you could argue that, no, this guy's literally risking the end of the planet. So we should roll all that back and he should be impeached for that. But of course, he's painted as the complete opposite. And then again, I think the big problem we have with kind of the faux, what seems to be astroturfed anti-war kind of whether it's like with people like Bernie Sanders previously with his hawkishness on Russia and Syria, or Tulsi Gabbard's hawkishness on the war on terror and the way she evidently doesn't seem to think Palestinians are worth mentioning, and just kind of nods along when Tucker's like, we should go to war in the South China Sea, nuclear war. That makes sense. She's like, I agree with you about Ukraine. Tucker is like, so maybe she doesn't, maybe she does, but it doesn't matter. The point is that the right populist thing is unfortunate because just like Trump, it shows that people are hungry for this. They know they're being bankrupted by the empire. They know that we've killed countless people. They might not realize it's in the millions at this point, but they do know that these wars were horrible and that hundreds of thousands of people were murdered and that it was all based on lies and that we sided with Al-Qaeda in multiple instances. And these are the guys that brought the towers down. And what have we done? Tens of thousands of troops have killed themselves as a result of these wars. And so there's a real reason to be furious with the establishment and to want all this to end. For whatever reason, the new Cold War stuff seems to almost nullify that. I don't exactly get it, but it's I almost wrote something like this in one of my articles. I think I ultimately took it out, but it was like, how did we go so fast from end the endless wars to, you know what, if you take on Russia and China at the same time, we'll just shut up and support you? Because it kind of does look like that. And it seems like even when we support these popular, almost it seems boosted so-called anti-war people, they always have this kind of poison pill where they're bad on something. And it's usually these days China, if you're looking at the right. So, but what it does mean at the end of the day, we just need a bigger bullhorn. That's why I'm very excited about the Dave Smith campaign, is that if, they want that, right? So they want, people always say we're better than the left on the good things the left is good on, and we're better than the right on the things the right is good on. And so the idea is, if we could just get to the people and bypass these figureheads and speak to them or debate their right-wing leaders, they would realize that we're obviously better than them on gun rights, or whatever it is, or non-intervention, or the or taxes, or the Federal Reserve, or money and banking, and we're better than the left on civil rights and drug laws and ending all the war, ending U.S. support for Israel and all these different things and these new Cold Wars. But the thing is if they are hungry for the anti-war sentiment, if we could get to them, they could see that it's a in the same way that libertarianism is a philosophy that's arguably neither left nor right, but it's a unified field theory of freedom. And it has to do with natural rights and Austrian economics and in the history of American, particularly 19th century individualism and that kind of philosophy. This is kind of what Rothbard was able to put together and make modern libertarianism ultimately. The anti-war movement it's not like I'm sure it would blow their minds to see that there's somebody who's saying, no, we don't need to build up with China either. And we certainly shouldn't be doing what we're doing with NATO. And we don't have to be in NATO. And we're not just saying it like Trump going, they should be spending more money on American weapons systems. No, we mean it. We're out of NATO. And we're ending and we mean it. When we say, we don't just talk about how we want to end the war in Syria so that people go, wow, that guy's really good. He's legit. When meanwhile we're pushing for war in other places and not talking about Israel bombing Syria every week and imposing and how we still have Caesar Act sanctions, and who knows how many people have starved to death in Syria in the last year. But I know that since the beginning of 2021, they said 60% of the population, more than 12 million people, were at the brink of starvation, basically, or facing starvation. And then, of course, we occupy about a third of the country. Most people don't know that. Most people have no idea. And, again, it's just we're not just going to go. We had, use Afghanistan as an excuse it's not an excuse, as a great argument for why, the blob is lying to the American people. That war never had to happen. And look at look at how the stated purposes were completely the opposite of what happened. And you spent $2 trillion, you lost thousands of American troops and killed roughly this cost of war project at Brown University suggests that I think it's 241,000 people died in Afghanistan and Pakistan together in that war. And for what exactly, and it's just the Taliban is in power the same way they were before the war started. And I don't even like that argument because it's none of our business who runs Kabul or Kandahar. It's none of our business. But the long story short, I'll just say, we would talk about the economic war. We would talk about starving 22 something million people in Afghanistan. I think it's I don't remember if it's the World Food Program or who that said that. But Kyle and Will have written up stuff about how Kyle Lanzone and Will Porter, the news editors at Libertarian Institute. It would talk, great article. Just look up, I think it's 13,000 babies have died as a result of this economic war in Afghanistan just in the first couple of months of the year. And it doesn't get talked about. I just saw a huge show with a bunch of big name libertarians on it, and they brought up Afghanistan. Nobody mentions the economic war because it's just not even people don't think it's worth mentioning, I guess, or it's just not brought up in the news that much. And meantime, we're going to be responsible for, especially now when you look at the sanctions on Russia and the crisis with wheat and all these other resources, especially the food crisis. It's wreaking havoc in Palestine alone. So just, yeah, I think there's a lot we could bring to the table in the discussion where people see that this is a unified thing. We're non-interventionists. We're not just using some of this rhetoric to get you to support some other intervention somewhere else.
Hey guys, welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. And what I've been doing is putting so much work lately into Substack, which is the premier way now to support the Liberty Weekly podcast. So go on over to libertyweekly.net/Substack. The reason I chose it was to feature my writing, and you can see that I have bonus episodes in here. I have early access to new episodes. I have early access to my feature articles that will be run at the Libertarian Institute. I'm putting blog posts in there. I'm putting, I like to write poetry, so I put poetry in there too. So you can see that these are all the posts that I've featured since I started working on my Substack, and that has been the premier way to help support the Liberty Weekly podcast. Guys, this is a value for value show, so if you appreciate the work that I do, the hard work that I put into this show, and you get value out of it, and if you're in a position to do so, please consider giving value back, and Substack is a great way to do that. I'm still doing Patreon, however, and you can check out all the other ways to help support this work over at libertyweekly.net/support. Patreon is one of them. And have been linking all of my posts that I do over at Substack on Patreon as well. But Substack really is the premier way. And thank you guys. I have been getting much more attention in the last few weeks now that I switched to Substack than I have in the years that I've been doing this content. So join the community, get access to this great content. I'm working on really putting out stuff like once every other day. And so I think that this is a great way to get access to my work. So head on over to libertyweekly.net/Substack. Thanks, guys. And I think it's especially important to be making inroads with single issue coalitions right now. And I know you and I, Connor, there's people in the anti-imperialist movement who, we're friends with and that we support and listen to and things like that. And it'd be really nice because I've seen some of those people get really turned off by the culture war issues, right? And it just seems like every time there's inroads that are being made on what you and I believe, and I think they believe is the most important issue, something pops up, like the abortion debate or this whole teachers' critical race theory thing or some shit like that. And I have my feelings about those things, but I'm not willing to abandon a single issue coalition because we don't agree on abortion or something like that.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I have opinions on that stuff too. I just don't I have a division of labor thing here. I'm focusing on foreign policy. So maybe that's my bias, but it's pretty obvious to me that one is way more important right now than the other.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what side you're on. By the way, if you're I hate to, well, I mean, I know there's a huge argument. Maybe I sound like a libertarian or something or whatever, but I don't understand. Can we just get rid of the public school thing, or at least why aren't we should decentralize it completely to the point where this is not even an issue. It's kind of ridiculous that we're even still talking about this. And after all this time, it just seems like something that we should that the libertarians especially should have nothing to do with. But look, I agree. It's whatever's going on there. That's very weird. But I don't. It's just I don't even know I don't know enough of the details to even speak cogently about it because I'm focusing on this stuff. And you're right. It's something comes up every time, it seems like, to divide the movement along the lines of this culture war. And I mean, especially when you consider the fact that Republicans should be really losing their minds right now over people like Graham, and the Democrats should be losing their minds over what people like Barbara Lee are doing, because Barbara Lee was the lone vote. She was better than Ron Paul on the 2001 AUMF after 9/11. She said basically this would lead. This is a blank check to war, and we're going to be carrying out the exact same kinds of attacks that we're decrying here today against civilians, and then the whole thing will backfire on us. I don't remember all the verbatim what she said, but most of what she predicted ultimately came true. And that was the bravery to do that just a few days after the attack. Oh my God. I mean, it's really unparalleled. But now she's going to Kiev and promising weapons alongside Nancy Pelosi, standing there with the lady who's saying we're in it to win it and all this. So,
moreover, she's still in fucking government. 20 years later, she's still in fucking government.
Well, look at Pelosi. I mean, how old is Pelosi again?
Well, there's a picture of her with like JFK, right?
Oh, I never saw. Oh, yeah, I do think I've seen that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, look at Graham. Look at all these people. At least I guess he's carrying on the tradition of McCain. Oh, Pelosi is 82.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
But yeah, listen, these people I'm sure that plays into it a little bit too. They figure they're going to be dead soon anyway. I mean, that has to play into it a little bit. So I mean, this is just absolutely disgusting. But I just think that, I think that there are priorities that are higher than these other issues. And the truth is if you roll back, I know this is a little bit more of a long-term thing, and people don't like that, is they want to deal with whatever's happening right now and own the other side or whatever it is. But the truth is if you roll back the empire and address this issue, first of all, you're going to build a coalition that can probably help you on a lot of other things that you want to accomplish as well, as a libertarian specifically. And also, once you roll that back, especially if you do it to a large extent, like bring all the troops home, for instance, and cut the Pentagon budget, well, certainly it should be. I would argue, I don't think we need a Pentagon at this point. I don't think it's fit to exist after what it's done, or any of these national security agencies. But say you cut the Pentagon budget down by more than 75% or just over 75%, you get rid of all those 800 bases, bring all the troops home, end all the hot wars, end all the sanctions regimes, open up trade completely with North Korea, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, China, Russia. And you do all this, and now and you get rid of the CIA, get rid of the NSA and all these things. What if then at that point, now you have a lot more of a leg to stand on domestically to enforce your will and to say, hey, this is what we want as Floridians. This is what we want as Texans. And then you can have your own votes. And it's what Robert Taft used to talk about and all those quotes Ron Paul has in his books about him. That, when I say freedom, I don't just mean free enterprise. I mean the liberty of every man to decide, how he wants to run his own business, as long as he doesn't enforce his views on other people and tell them how to run their business, and the right of a man to choose his own occupation, and the right of a family to decide what food they eat and what they teach their kids, and local communities can decide how their services are run and who their leaders shall be, and how, who they want to elect to office, and what kind of education system they want to have locally, all these different things. That's what, we should be pushing for. And I just think that you have such, in the absence of the empire, and you'd really have to roll back the progressive era, but I think the most important part is the overseas empire and the domestic ancillaries. You have to address that, because otherwise it's just, the state is just too powerful. They'll roll right over you. Yeah. And in the meantime, all of our fighting with each other, all that does is help them. Their main game for since I've been alive has been, how do we get these sides to clash and hate each other as much as possible? And in the meantime, what have they done? They've taken trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars from us, looted the whole treasury, printed up all this. I mean, COVID was one of the best examples of that. Trillions of dollars in corporate welfare and just looting people's savings, like just absolute plunder. And it's just, and now this whole war in Ukraine. I mean, it's just I've often wondered, at what point do the American people say enough is enough? I don't know, but we seem to. It's much more comfortable, like I said, instead of holding the the ruling class accountable, it's much easier to hate your neighbor because, you know, whatever the show, the news channel he watches, or his view on abortion or something like this. It is so depressing. But yeah, I do believe that libertarians, if we want to focus, if you do have an interest in all that domestic stuff, you got to kind of balance it out with the foreign policy, because you'll have a much better chance at having influence here and decentralizing power if you roll that back first. Because otherwise, they have a great argument to say that no, it's you know, they can just enforce their will. It's very difficult to you know, look. I mean, I guess I'm just saying that there's just too much power. The thought of a state seceding is still way off in the third rail and way out of the, you know, realm of discussion that is even considered acceptable. I think that would change if you were to change the philosophy if you were to basically renounce the empire and roll back here and go back to being a constitutional republic or something approximating that. And that's the first most important step to doing it.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, not to be an elitist or anything, because I certainly have my own faults, but to be able to care about and engage on foreign policy on a level that's a little bit deeper than just repeating talking points that you hear on your favorite podcast, I think that's important. Because you don't really understand it, you know, unless you do something like that.
Well, the antiwar.com and Libertarian Institute and the Ron Paul Institute are sitting right there. And if you read antiwar.com and read the viewpoints, you'll come across all the best websites on the internet, and you can go find them. Responsible Statecraft, Consortium News, you know, Ted Carpenter and Doug Bandau's pieces at the Cato Institute, which has a phenomenal foreign policy department despite Cato's other problems, and you know, Mint Press and the Gray Zone and all these other sites. There's and of course, you know, the truth is that the hawks and the censors know all this, because who do they go after? When Trump came into office, and I think it was either Prop or Not or the Hamilton 68 dashboard or whatever, you know, I'll find it and maybe retweet it or something, or send it to you for the show notes. But you know, I always look back at this. I think Greenwald and Ben Norton wrote a piece about this for The Intercept. When they announced all the sites that were blamed for Trump's election that needed to be addressed by basically these censorship boards that cropped up in the wake of Trump winning. And Bill Kristol and these people were all kind of behind a lot of these things. But with the sites that they named, it wasn't Fox News or Breitbart or whatever the heck, you know, people would think, or InfoWars or whatever. I mean, maybe they're in there as token gestures, but the real things that they were talking about were the Ron Paul Institute and LouRockwell.com and antiwar.com and even Zero Hedge and the Gray Zone and Mint Press and the American Conservative and all these different things. And I remember in the big, I think even Moon of Alabama's mentioned in there, or I read somewhere on his site where he had the diagram from that one of these websites that was running this. And I remember they had big letters like Aaron Mate's name and stuff like this. And you're just like, oh, I get it. It's the anti-war movement that they're very concerned about. And then you look at who his Twitter permanently kicked off and still not brought back. I mean, it's Dan McAdams, Peter Van Buren. Scott almost got kicked off at Twitter. He only came back, I think, because he made whatever concession they demanded of him, and it made more sense, you know, from a business perspective, et cetera, to come back and be on the platform, because it really is still probably the most important way to get your message out. I mean, Twitter is kind of the public commons and all this, but yeah, I just think that as far as the foreign policy thing, people can really do themselves a lot of good. Just read antiwar.com every day. I know you and I say that, and I don't know how much people like get it, but like that is it's a simple thing. Jason and Dave and Kyle and Will have these articles that are like, you know, at the most 7 or 8 paragraphs. You'll be more informed than just about anybody you come into contact with the rest of the day about foreign policy, and you'll really know. And like, it's pretty, if you just read that every day, and there's like 6 or 5 6 7 editorials to check out. If you just do that for a little while, you read antiwar.com every day and listen to, you know, your show and Conflicts of Interest and Scott's show, you'll catch up fast. And like, honestly, it's I think it's pretty addictive, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, that's kind of how I got hooked. was looking at all this same stuff, and you listen to people particularly like Scott and Dan McAdams, and reading Ron Paul, and back in the day, libertarians, at least when I started to really get interested in all this stuff, there was no real confusion. Like Lou Rockwell and Dave Smith and Tom Woods and Ron and Dan, it was never a question of like, yeah, the Federal Reserve and money and all this, but foreign policy, even Rothbard, the famous quote, I have it somewhere in my bookmarks, but it's probably too far down now. But that full Murray Rothbard quote is so great. He says in Private Correspondence in the 50s that the key to the whole libertarian business is the war-peace question. And he says, and right now, the most important thing we can do is to oppose this Cold War. He goes, which I believe our aggressive policy is largely responsible, or for which is largely responsible. And that could be written right now. It's so true. I don't know. I just recommend people should just check this stuff out, because it's not to catch up is not all that difficult. To dig in and do deep dives and learn, as much as all the experts do and everything, and all of our heroes. I mean, that takes an exceptional amount of work. But just to like get involved and be a part of all this, I mean, I think it's within anybody's reach who's just committed to it, wants to read and do the work of reading the news every day. But I'm telling you, once you start doing it, you'll just get hooked. I think it's just I don't know. I think that it's just sitting there. Like, I'm just waiting for antiwar.com to become like one of the biggest sites in like alt media or something, because it's just eventually people are going to realize, like, I remember when I first discovered it, I was like, whoa, like, that's incredible. So they do all this work for you so you can just read through these news articles, and then someone's curating Scott or Kyle, all these brilliant op-eds that provide so much context and unique and studied perspective for you to really comprehend exactly what the hell is going on here and make sense of what appears to be kind of the way it's kind of presented to the American people basically is that, oh, this is all too confusing for you. Just let the experts take the wheel, and this really isn't any of you don't have any role in this anyway. So just go back, like Bill Hicks would say, go back to sleep, America. Your government is in control. Right. That's basically how it's presented on the news.
Well, and that's why it's so important for libertarians to be good on this, because frankly, I mean, it's a blind spot for a lot of us. I mean, I'm saying that in like, I hope I didn't come off as being a smug asshole just now, because like for years, if you listen to the show, for years, I did not get into foreign policy, because it didn't engage me at the same thing. And I figured, I got that box checked because I said, war is bad. War is the health of the state. It's financed with the Federal Reserve. Okay. I got foreign policy down, right?
Well, I was like that. I mean, I was almost a vulgar libertarian, or whatever you would call that. I was very aggressive with leftists. This is before I started writing and being like a public libertarian, or worked for the Institute. And I was very against neoconservatives, and I hated the right. And I thought, the whole point was like, I figured it out. It's the non-aggression principle, and this is how you privatize this, and this is why the Federal Reserve causes the business cycle, and this is why that's illegal and unconstitutional, and we're not even supposed to have fiat money. That's illegal too, and I'm just kind of being facetious here, making a caricature of it, but. But just on my own as libertarian, I was into more of the philosophy as a whole. Yeah. It took me a few years. I think it was specifically like Ron and Dan and getting into Scott's show and finding antiwar.com. Like, I had to get there somewhere. But it was definitely like I knew that was the issue just from listening to people like Dave and Ron and Lou and even Tom, especially back in the day. I still haven't really seen his anti-war speeches are still pretty unparalleled in terms of how great they were. But it took me a while before I just decided this was the thing I was going to focus on. Yeah.
But I mean, even to go a level deeper than just to say, oh, well, The United States had a big hand in overthrowing Ukraine's government in 2014. Like, it's great to be at that point, but if you can explain how it happened, you know, that's even more powerful. And like, I just don't, I mean, that next level of analysis is just something that I feel is lacking a bit in our movement.
Well, yeah. And that's what that's, I mean, that's why there is such an interest in keeping things bland. That's why, if you look at, like, that's why I think the Mises Caucus and stuff like this is a great thing, because they are sending around real foreign policy experts to go and give talks, like Scott and others, and Dan McAdams actually, or they've had him give talks at some of their events, and it's because, yeah, we do need that. It's not enough to just, like you said, say that the war is the health of the state and then pat yourself on the back for saying something like that. And the truth is, Ron Paul never did that. I you know, that was the biggest regret I had about Gary Johnson. Have you ever seen that video?
What is Aleppo?
Do you remember that? No, not just that. Do you remember the video where he gets interviewed after that and he has to kind of he has to clean up that mess, and they ask him about Hillary Clinton's foreign policy, and he just doesn't know what to say, but somebody told him, you should get mad about this stuff. So he just starts going, I think it's horrible. I think it's horrible what these policies have been, and these wars are wrong. And it's just it was like that. But, like, you know, truthfully, if you could get some, yeah, I mean, that's the real key. And I think Ron Paul had that effect with people. I think people say now truth bombs, red pills, and all this stuff. Well, that was his game back in the day. The whole Ron Paul revolution was essentially that, when he explained the whole lead up to 9/11, and then people will quickly look into that and they're going to see, hey, we back in apartheid regime. I think that's a big thing about what happened just now with this Shireen Abu Akleh, this journalist for Al Jazeera, who was just murdered in cold blood at outside the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank. People are going to look at those videos, and they're going to look at videos of the IDF beating the shit out of pallbearers and people attending her funeral and attacking her hearse to pull Palestinian flags off of it, and all of this. Going into the church and taking out Palestinian flags. And they're going to look into that, and they're going to ask, why do the Palestinian people, why are they not able to defend themselves? One, two, what is this? Like, I thought this was a separate country next door at war with little Israel. So you're telling me how did these stormtroopers get so close to it? They're going to understand that this is an occupation that's been going on since the 60s. They're going to start to realize that this is an apartheid state. They're going to realize that, once they find out about what's going on in Gaza, I think they're going to throw up. But basically, yeah, I think it's opportunities like this, like what's happening in Ukraine, is a wonderful opportunity to rewind the tape and show people exactly what happened with the coup, why the coup happened, how this EU association agreement actually paved the way for them to be completely subordinated, for all intents and purposes, to the NATO security architecture. I mean, that's what it really was. I mean, they act like, oh, they wanted to move west. They wanted to be a Western democracy, and they have the right to do that, and democracy, freedom, and I was going to make a joke about the Azov-Battalion or something. But the point is that this was really a gateway to NATO membership from the very beginning. And this is after the coup happened 6 years after Bush promises NATO membership. And it's just, obvious. I mean, when you look through the whole history of it, and then I think people are completely they're very there's things about what our government does in foreign policy that are ways to get people very interested. So in some sense, I think the talking points are very helpful, because people will wonder, like, that's how I started looking at all this stuff. It's like, Nazis? What? Like, I couldn't believe it. I remember learning that, that the Afghanistan government we've been backing for whatever, at that time it was 15 years or whatever, was filled with a bunch of communists and warlords and drug kingpins and child rapists. I didn't know that. But that blew my mind, and I read Fool's Errand to understand the conflict and what was really going on. And then you learn about the Northern Alliance and all the opportunities we had to avoid the war, and how the Taliban was ready to hand bin Laden over, and how we let bin Laden get away, and all the different war crimes that were carried on, and how the whole place became basically a welfare scheme for the military industrial complex and all these NGOs tied to the State Department, and how the Army was a paper tiger, and how the experts could tell that the whole thing was going to collapse as soon as the U.S. removed its air power and its special operations and its infantry from supporting it. And then you understand, that they're at war. It's with half of the country, basically Pashtun tribesmen, not some international terrorist organization that's bent on imposing Sharia law in Washington or something. But I grew up, with those same kind of assumptions, and you and I joked about how, it's kind of crazy how long it takes even people like us in terms of like our lives overall to realize, whoa, the difference between the Taliban and Al Qaeda or something, because that's how heavy the propaganda is.
Yeah. Well,
so,
that's why we need to know more than just talking points, because there are other talking points on the other side. And like, you're right. It's enough to get people interested who are maybe receptive to the alternative arguments, but it's like, there's talking points on the other side too. And it's like, if we're sitting here saying, okay, yes, the Azov battalion is a neo-Nazi battalion, right? Well, maybe there's a counter to that. There's a counter narrative that needs to be soundly defeated. Like,
right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's where all the education comes in, and that's how when we all learn all this stuff and basically just have to keep at it. But yeah, eventually that's the whole point. But the truth is, we do have the truth. I almost was redundant. We do have the truth on our side, so it's just a matter of preparing for those arguments. And I think, actually, I'll be honest with you, I do think there is an increased interest in foreign policy in the libertarian movement
right now.
Yeah, I do notice that for sure. And I think that is that's obviously incredible. And so I do think we are getting to the point now where it's just going to be, in terms of that debate, when and if it's really allowed, it's going to be devastating for the other side.
Yeah. Well, this is the Super Bowl. I mean, it's I guess I hate to use that analogy, but this is it, man. Like, this could be for all the marbles.
Yeah, no kidding. But but you know what? The truth is, I think a lot of people are already the American people really more or less have to be bullied into supporting all this stuff. They have to actually be like berated, basically.
That's why I'm bullying people to learn more.
Yeah, exactly. And that works too. I hope that works too.
Well, truthfully, I feel a little bad because I feel like an asshole right now.
Well, I think no, I think it's fine. I think I think it's just people just need to know like how to do it. Because sometimes if someone says like you should go learn this, and then it's like they go to like, I don't know, if you tell someone they have to like understand all history economics, you give them man economy and state, then you are kind of a dick, right? Because it's like that's a 1,000-page book. So if you gave them human action, you're an asshole, right? But if you give them economics in one lesson and start them off on on the Rothbard text we all start off with, in the case against the Fed and what has government done to our money and and meltdown and all this great stuff and the Fed and all this stuff, they're gonna realize like, oh, I know where to go now, and like that's how it works. So I just think people just, I don't know. I mean, if you read enough already and read antiwar.com.
Right.
And believe me, you're going to really quickly start to understand what's going on here, and you'll know where to look for the details.
Well, I mean, I guess like maybe my point is then if you are a libertarian and you're not reading anything, you should be reading antiwar.com. If you're a libertarian and you're reading Karl Menger right now, maybe you should be reading antiwar.com. Instead.
Principles of Economics is great.
Yeah.
But right now Dave DeCamp is probably the guy you should be reading.
Yeah. Or I mean, if you're like you said, if you're reading, I don't know, Man Economy in State or Human Action or something right now, given the point in time, maybe you should be putting your effort into figuring out what the fuck's going on.
Well, we were reading that stuff,
A couple of years ago.
Barack Obama was president, and we thought, Hollywood was going to last forever, and the movies are great, we're partying, everything. It's just not the same now.
Yeah.
The whole culture is totally different, actually, in such a short amount of time. And it really did feel like, I mean, honestly, I if I had been paying attention, in 2014, 2015, I would have thought that if I had really been paying attention to foreign policy, I probably would have had that same sense. Partially, maybe not right now, but a real sense of urgency. But I didn't know. I didn't know what was going on in Ukraine at that time. I had no idea. And I was listening to libertarian, TM podcasts.
Yeah.
So if they were talking about it, it might have gone over my head, or I might have just missed it. But at the time it felt like, okay, well, I'll just, take some time. I wasn't even reading really a bunch of news on the internet. I was just reading books from the Mises Institute and Ron Paul books and Tom Woods books and all this stuff. And that's all awesome. I really do think people should do that. And I have a stack of books I'm working on getting through right now. Yeah, I mean, the most important thing I think right now is just for people to, check out those sites. Check out the Institute. Check out our Institute. Check out the Ron Paul Institute. Responsible Statecraft is another great site to look at every day. Yeah, I just think I think it's incredible. And also, they're working so hard to get people scared to death of Russia and China that it would be so beneficial to have our side, equipped with the right arguments to explain how, just basically how we are pushing for war in those theaters, and setting the table for it.
Yeah.
And it does not have to be this way.
Yeah.
And so, and they'll definitely realize it. My biggest pet peeve, I've talked with you about this many times, is that even when libertarians are pushed with arguments about China and don't you think we ought to do something, they're going to start eating up all these different countries. They're going to take over Southeast Asia and they're building up their military and all this. No, all those arguments, even when libertarians go on the defensive and attack those arguments, most of them leave the Asia pivot off the table. They just act like it's not happening.
Yeah.
And that is really crazy, because that is something that the American people really need to be made aware of, because it's, we're going to end up in a very similar situation like right now, where all of a sudden Putin invades Ukraine. He must be the next Hitler. He wants to be the next great Russian emperor and reconstitute the Soviet Union and all this nonsense that there's not any evidence for. Yeah, I mean, it's just the way that they're able. What does Robert Higgs say? They truncate the antecedents. That's what's happening right now.
Well, right. And that's another reason why you should know more than just talking points, is because then you can identify what is bullshit and what is not. Like, I mean, even people who know the talking points that we, libertarian podcasters would talk about, even listeners or people in the movement who know those talking points still fall for the propaganda when they see it. And one thing I've noticed, getting a deeper understanding, is that you're able to spot that stuff more readily. And of course, it doesn't stop just there. It's like, well, we can read all day long, but unless we do some kind of activism, it's not going to make any kind of difference. So, defend the guard, things like that, nullification. Yeah. I mean, getting involved, I like doing rallies. I mean, I'm just thinking about stuff. It's like this is one of the things that local politics doesn't really help too much, right? Because it's not a local issue. So, I mean,
right. Although I do think it sounds it's not going to get people like all hyped up or anything, but I think there really is a value in just badgering your congressman and your senator, and basically I've never voted for anybody that won. I've only ever voted against McCain and Arpaio out here, and I've never voted other than that. But basically, if I ever called these people up when there was like a relevant resolution being voted on with regards to particularly the war in Yemen, like a war powers challenge or something like that, I'd always tell them, I voted for you, and I'm not gonna vote for you next time if you don't come through on this. Do you have any idea what's going on? And I would explain the whole thing. actually, I said that to a guy named to the office of a guy out here named David Schweikert, and this was the last bill they put forward was sort of after the withdrawal from Afghanistan last year. So I gave a call, and this ultimately got stripped. I think it was from the NDAA, and Ro Khanna might have led this one. And so I gave a call to this congressman in Arizona to tell him to vote for it. And I got a letter back about Afghanistan. So that was encouraging, because obviously the system. Okay, so maybe I'm arguing against myself here, but what I am saying is that if people are really threatened with like a barrage of calls and letters, and they're told that like they're going to lose all their support, and that a lot of it hinges on these foreign policy decisions, I do think that has some sort of an impact.
Yeah.
And I've heard that from people who are actually, you know, in politics. Or in the activist community, like Hassan El-Tayeb, who's you know, part of the Quaker group that did lead the charge of all the opposition to the war in Yemen in D.C., who's talked to Scott a bunch. Yeah, it's one of those things where it does seem sort of insurmountable, but that's to your point, where I think education becomes so much more important. And just getting the word out, because the more aware people are, we'll find solutions. It's kind of like a libertarian market principles thing. Like, we'll figure it out. But the truth is people need to be mobilized, and first they have to be, you know, alerted or made informed effectively about what they need to go out and oppose. Like, I'm not even a very political guy. If someone asked me to like write something up for a senator, I would end up just writing something like an article I've written, right? Because I'm not the most political guy, to be honest. So I wouldn't know how to write out a policy platform. But you know, once people are aware of what's going on, there's any number of things we can do to, you know, roll back the Asia pivot and to force the Blinken to call or to meet in Geneva with Lavrov and negotiate a settlement over Crimea and the Donbass and the neutral status of Ukraine and all this stuff, because it's the only way. We would argue that, look, you're killing Ukrainians by keeping this thing going. And just because that's what you want, and you want Russia weakened and destroyed, we're not going to allow you to do that anymore. And so we're going to vote out every last one of these guys that votes for any of these weapons, any of these aid bills, and any more of these weapons transfers. And, you know, we should, that Lend-Lease thing should be repealed immediately. And like, there's all these different things, but, you know, it does seem daunting when it gets into politics, because the thing is so convoluted, and it's kind of designed to push away people who aren't special interests, who can just, you know, get what they want from the trough. But I mean, and the honeypot. But I do believe that if there's enough energy and there's enough opposition on a gut level across the spectrum to these you know, these hawkish pro-war policies and the empire itself and how much it costs us, that there's definitely ways that this can be fixed. It's not going to come from electing some guy from the elite like Elon Musk or Donald Trump or some Democrat who promises hope and change or something like that. But it you know, I do think the Dave Smith thing is a big part of this equation, is getting another guy like Ron Paul out there, you know, bringing this conversation to the forefront, where people just simply have no choice but to bring it up. You know, it's a part of the national conversation at that point. But I think we're going to realize, if he comes in there, that I do think the movement is getting stronger at this point. The problem is there's still a lot of division. But like I said, I have been really encouraged, especially by like younger libertarians who seem to be really interested in foreign policy. And so that's thrilling. And so when Dave comes in there, there's already, you know, we've kind of been sitting on the working hard, but not, you know, it hasn't been the Ron Paul moment, right? For like since almost 10 years. So when that actually does happen, and, you know, all this comes back to the surface, we could realize we're much stronger than we thought. And that's what I'm hoping for right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of a good end note. I'll say this one thing. I did write my senator, I think, when Soleimani was assassinated. And I think I got a letter back saying, Yeah, that's nice, and I take this very seriously, but Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terror. So,
No kidding. Oh God, I love when they I love when they do that. Yeah, I still that might even top the thing where I'm talking about Yemen and they send me a letter about Afghanistan, which, by the way, was still an argument for basically, I forget what the details are. I have it saved somewhere, but it was basically still an argument about how I don't remember if he supported. Yeah, I'm blanking on what his policy was, but it was basically something hawkish about how the Taliban and the threat and all of this and how we ought to stay. It might have been something like that.
yeah.
But yeah, that is just hilarious.
Yeah.
#1 state sponsor.
Yeah.
Compared to who are you leaving off the list so that they come in first place?
Yeah. All right, buddy. Well, where can people find your work? I mean, I know they probably know, but go ahead.
So everything I got is at the Libertarian Institute. You'll see all my articles in the featured articles section, and I co-host Conflicts of Interest with a different show every week. I do with Kyle Anzalone, and the show also, Will Porter is also part of the show. Of course, he's taken a temporary hiatus from actually, doing the show itself. But Kyle and Will are always putting out great pieces in the news section we have now at the Institute. And most of just about everything I write, you'll also find in the viewpoints at antiwar.com. And we also run the show. Every episode you'll find in the antiwar.com blog as well.
Awesome.
Oh, and I'm on Twitter at Freeman's Mind 96 as well.
Yeah, right on. Okay. Well, hopefully it won't be 6 months till I have your ass back on again. But
Absolutely, Pat. Anytime.
Looking forward to it, man. Thanks.
Hell yeah. Thank you.